Imagine a world where murderers are not hiding, not remorseful, not silent. Instead, they wear costumes, build sets, and invite camera crews to proudly reenact the killings they once committed in full cinematic style. This isn't dystopian fiction. This happened, and it became the foundation of one of the most disturbing and surreal documentaries ever made, The Act of Killing, directed by Joshua Oppenheimer. The story doesn't begin in silence. It begins with laughter, and then a scream. In 1965, Indonesia witnessed one of the bloodiest and least acknowledged genocides of the 20th century. Within a year, over 500,000 people, some estimates say 1 million, were murdered under the suspicion of being communists or communist sympathizers. The killings followed a military coup that brought General Suharto to power. But what makes this genocide uniquely horrific is not just the scale, it's the executioners. The killers weren't all uniformed soldiers. Many were gangsters, street thugs, and paramilitary youth, men who just days before had been selling movie tickets or collecting protection money in back alleys. They became executioners overnight, and after the bloodshed, they weren't punished. They were rewarded, elevated, celebrated. In some towns, they were heroes. This is what Joshua Oppenheimer discovered while filming a documentary about plantation workers in North Sumatra. Time and again, survivors and their families refused to speak, not out of shame, but out of fear. Their tormentors still lived nearby, still held power, still smiled. And then, something surreal happened. The perpetrators, not the victims, offered to speak. Even more bizarrely, they wanted to perform. Anwar Congo was one of them. Anwar, a former leader of a notorious death squad in Medan, personally killed hundreds, possibly more than 1,000, people. His favored method was strangulation with a wire, because, as he casually explains on camera, it made less mess. In the film's opening, Anwar stands atop a building, dancing. The rooftop was where many of his victims took their last breath. Now, decades later, it is a stage. He is not hiding. He is starring. When Oppenheimer gave Anwar and his fellow death squad members the opportunity to recreate their murders however they wanted, they didn't hesitate. They welcomed the idea with excitement. For them, this wasn't a reckoning. It was a performance. They dressed up, wrote scripts, choreographed scenes. They staged interrogations, rapes, executions, sometimes in the style of gangster flicks, sometimes westerns, even musicals. In one scene, Anwar wears a crisp white suit and walks through flames, while dancers sing around him. Victims in the scene thank him for sending them to heaven. It's not satire, it's a delusion, but one that they fully believe, one they've lived inside for decades. For Anwar and the others, cinema was not just a fantasy, it was their blueprint for violence. They had grown up watching Hollywood action films, idolizing John Wayne and Al Pacino. Killing, for them, had cinematic logic. They weren't butchers, they were cowboys and heroes, ridding the world of the bad guys. Oppenheimer's genius and moral risk was in letting them express this delusion. And so the viewer is trapped in a hall of mirrors. The documentary constantly blurs the line between reality and theater, guilt and pride, memory and myth. One moment, you're watching a behind-the-scenes discussion about makeup. The next, a man demonstrates how he decapitated someone, casually smiling as he gestures with his hands. You watch, disoriented, horrified. You begin to wonder, are they reenacting or remembering? The weight of this moral inversion is suffocating. Oppenheimer, who lived among the killers for years while making the film, has described the experience as profoundly traumatizing. There were days when he couldn't sleep, nights filled with nightmares. His body revolted against what his camera captured, yet he stayed, because he knew, if he didn't film it, no one would believe it. There is a scene late in the film that is among the most devastating ever captured in documentary history. Anwar, having played the role of his own victim in a staged interrogation, begins to feel something shift inside him. The camera rolls as he watches the playback. Something breaks, his face tightens, he coughs, he stumbles, he clutches his stomach, he tries to explain what he feels. Did the people I tortured feel what I felt when I played the victim? He asks, and then, silence. He cannot speak, he cannot breathe. For a brief, harrowing moment, the wall of performance cracks. He is no longer the actor, he is no longer in control. The past is no longer a script, it is real, and it is inside him. Oppenheimer doesn't interrupt, the camera lingers, the air thickens. It is a moment more haunting than any scream. The making of the film was an act of danger. None of the Indonesian crew are named in the credits. They remained anonymous, not as a symbolic gesture, but for their safety. The film was never submitted for censorship in Indonesia, precisely to avoid putting citizens at risk. Yet despite its unofficial status, the film spread through flash drives, underground screenings, activist groups, university classrooms, and it sparked something. For many Indonesians, it was the first time they saw the past so clearly and so truthfully, a mirror held to the face of national amnesia. Oppenheimer followed the film with a second documentary, The Look of Silence, which focused on the victims. But the act of killing remains unique because it didn't ask for guilt. It didn't confront perpetrators with accusations. It simply gave them a stage, and in doing so, it revealed how deep the rot of denial can go. In the film's final scene, Anwar returns to that rooftop. He looks over the edge. No music plays. He begins to retch, but nothing comes out. He coughs. He gags. His body shakes. It is the same spot where he killed so many. But now, he stands alone. No costumes, no applause, no script, just the wind and the memory of a screen dot. When the act of killing premiered, it didn't arrive with a whisper, it detonated. The first major unveiling took place at the Telluride Film Festival in the US, followed shortly by screenings at Toronto and Berlin. But few, if any, of the critics and filmmakers present were prepared for what they were about to see. It wasn't just the content, grotesque, surreal, perverse in its theatricality. It was the very form of the film. A documentary that shattered all conventions. A film that stared into the eyes of evil and let it dance for the camera. Within hours of its premiere, word began to spread through film circles like a storm. Werner Herzog called it unprecedented in the history of cinema. Errol Morris, the mind behind The Thin Blue Line, was so stunned that he joined Herzog in becoming an executive producer, not to influence, but to protect and promote. It's as if you're watching Nazis reenact a Holocaust, Morris said, only they're doing it in song and dance. The global critical response was overwhelming. Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, and every major film outlet quickly registered the film with near-perfect scores. But the real impact went beyond metrics. There was something deeply unsettling happening in auditoriums. Audiences were not just disturbed, they were paralyzed. Some walked out, others stayed in their seats long after the credits rolled, staring in silence. Q&A sessions with Oppenheimer turned into therapy sessions. Viewers, critics, academics, human rights activists asked not how the film was made, but how he could bear to survive it. Major newspapers devoted long, agonized essays to unpacking the film. The Guardian called it the most important documentary of the decade. The New York Times ran multiple op-eds. The Atlantic described it as documentary, as moral hallucination. Each piece struggled to describe the indescribable, the feeling of watching men cheerfully describe mass murder and then break down under the weight of their own narrative illusions. But the film's reach wasn't just aesthetic or critical, it went nuclear in political and human rights circles. In Geneva, Officials from the United Nations Human Rights Council attended private screenings. Amnesty International issued a statement supporting the film's exposure of crimes against humanity. Human Rights Watch featured the film as a core part of its Southeast Asia advocacy toolkit. Activists began using it to reopen conversations about transitional justice, not just in Indonesia, but in other nations with unresolved violence. Rwanda, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Cambodia. Several parliaments in Europe, including those of the Netherlands and the UK, hosted screenings of the film, followed by panel discussions with genocide scholars, diplomats, and survivors. The discussions weren't abstract. They were raw, heated. Members of government asked why Indonesia had never faced a tribunal, why the military, decades later, still held such power, why silence had become law, and that silence, the very cultural and political amnesia the film revealed, became the real subject of global outrage. What stunned the world was not just the horror of 1965, it was the horror of the aftermath. These killers hadn't been hiding, they had been giving speeches, appearing on television, teaching their children, being celebrated. Indonesia had not forgotten the genocide, it had rewritten it. International journalists began to probe deeper. Reports in The Economist and Al Jazeera investigated how the paramilitary group Pancasila Youth, still active in politics, could maintain such visibility despite their documented role in mass violence. NGOs began campaigns to pressure Western governments to declassify documents relating to their involvement or passive complicity in the 1965 coup, especially the CIA and MI6, whose links to anti-communist purges during the Cold War had long been suspected. In Washington, D.C., a rare coalition of senators called for the release of documents related to U.S. support of the Suharto regime. Though heavily redacted, some cables began to surface, suggesting, indeed, that Western intelligence agencies knew of the killings and did little, if anything, to stop them. The film had done something no political report ever could. It made genocide visible, visceral, undeniable. But the reaction wasn't entirely supportive. Some Indonesian officials publicly condemned the film, not because they disputed the facts, but because it exposed them. At one screening in Singapore, an Indonesian diplomat dismissed the documentary as an insult to national dignity. A few days later, the same official quietly requested a private screening, off the record, in Indonesia itself, where the film was never officially released due to legal strategy. Underground screenings multiplied. Students packed lecture halls. University professors whispered warnings to each other before pressing play. Religious leaders began speaking cautiously, tentatively, about reconciliation. A few former military men even reached out to Oppenheimer anonymously, expressing shame or fear. In late 2013, Oppenheimer received an invitation from an unexpected place, the Indonesian National Human Rights Commission. They wanted to speak, off-camera, unofficially, but openly, about the film's implications. It wasn't an admission, but it was a crack in the dam. The Act of Killing was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 2014 Academy Awards. When the nomination was announced, Anwar Congo was reportedly confused. "I thought it was just a film for us," he said, "not for the world." He did not attend the ceremony. He was later reported to have stopped speaking to the press altogether. The film didn't win the Oscar, but it won something arguably greater: permanence. It is now studied in universities across the globe, in film schools, yes, but also in departments of ethics, history, psychology, and conflict studies. It is cited in academic papers, alongside works by Hannah Arendt and Primo Levi. It has become a reference point, not just for how we remember atrocities, but for how perpetrators remember themselves. It also changed documentary filmmaking. After the Act of Killing, the boundaries of what a documentary could do, and should do, were forever altered. The film became a debate in itself. Should we let monsters speak? Should we give them a stage? Do we risk normalizing horror by humanizing it? Oppenheimer never gave a definitive answer, but he said one thing, again and again, at screenings, across the world: silence is not neutrality, silence is complicity. In that spirit, the world did not stay silent, and yet, the silence in Indonesia remains, thinner now, cracking, but present, because the hardest thing about truth is not uncovering it, it's deciding what to do with it once it has a face. There are countries where memory is carved in stone, in monuments, in textbooks, in ceremonies, and then there is Indonesia, where memory was erased. When the act of killing first began circulating in Indonesia, it wasn't through cinemas or state television. It came like contraband, smuggled flash drives, encrypted links, anonymous DVD copies, passed hand to hand on university campuses. The film wasn't banned, but that was strategy, not mercy. Submitting it for censorship could have endangered lives, so it never was. Instead, it slipped through the cracks. In the capital Jakarta, student groups began hosting underground screenings. They printed out flyers with no logos. Often they would borrow classrooms or coffee shops after hours, and always, they prepared for interruption. Security personnel on lookout, phones switched off, doors locked from the inside. Those first viewers were mostly young, university students, artists, activists, the generation that had grown up post-Suharto, in an Indonesia that sold itself as modern and democratic, but never dared to discuss 1965. And for many of them, the film was not shocking, it was awakening. In hushed rooms, they watched smiling men describe rape and strangulation. They watched reenactments that looked like television soap operas until they didn't. They listened as Anwar Congo laughed, and then cried, and then fell silent. And for the first time, they saw what their history books had hidden. In Indonesian schools, the events of 1965 had long been described as a failed communist coup, crushed by patriotic resistance. The names of the murdered were never listed, the identity of the killers never questioned. A veil of silence fell over the genocide and stayed there for nearly 50 years. But the act of killing didn't just tear that veil, it set it on fire. In the months after the film's informal release, civil society in Indonesia began to shift. Young Indonesians began to ask questions publicly. They demanded to know who decided what version of history their textbooks contained. They challenged their professors. They confronted their own grandparents, and many of them learned a terrible truth. The killers lived not just on screen, but across the street, in the market, in their families. Oppenheimer received hundreds of emails from Indonesians. Some wrote in rage, accusing him of slander, of stirring wounds. Others, often in trembling, broken English, thanked him. "This is the first time I saw the truth," one wrote. "My grandfather disappeared in 1965. No one ever said how." But not everyone welcomed the mirror. The government remained largely silent. Officially, it said nothing, neither denouncing nor endorsing the film. But state-linked media launched attacks. Several news outlets accused Oppenheimer of manipulating facts and exploiting trauma. Others dismissed the film as Western propaganda. Meanwhile, paramilitary groups reacted with fury.
The Pancasila youth, still active, still powerful, issued veiled threats.
One of its leaders called the film an insult to our national heroes. On social media, some of the killers featured in the film proudly posted photos of themselves next to TV sets playing the documentary. They treated it as fame, as validation. But the spell didn't hold. In the weeks that followed, some of those same men went quiet, refused interviews, deleted posts. Whispers began to circulate. Certain scenes had gone too far. One man, in an off-the-record conversation, admitted he had seen something in himself he could not unsee. The most profound reaction, however, came from survivors. For decades, they had been silenced, marked as traitors, denied jobs, watched, forgotten. Now, they began to speak, in small gatherings, at village halls, in prayer groups,
Elderly Indonesians, many in their 70s and 80s, began telling their stories, not because they had found justice, but because finally, someone had listened, even if that listener was a scream. One such man, featured anonymously in The Look of Silence, spoke of watching his brother dragged away, never to return. For years, he had passed the killer in the street, bought rice from him, smiled. Now, after seeing the first film, he spoke, quietly, trembling, but freely, and his children heard him. For the first time, educational institutions began to stir. A handful of brave professors began assigning the film in sociology and ethics classes. Journalists started asking new questions. Debates erupted on university radio. What does it mean to live beside murderers? Can a country heal without confession? Is memory a right or a risk? The government could no longer pretend the conversation wasn't happening, so it shifted strategy. Instead of open denial, it leaned into delay. Promises of truth and reconciliation commissions were mentioned, then postponed. Lawmakers suggested creating a national forum for dialogue, but offered no date, no funding, no details. Behind the curtain, the old guard remained powerful. Many of the individuals involved in the 1965 killings still held local or regional positions of influence. Police chiefs, businessmen, politicians. Justice was not only unwelcome, it was dangerous. One wrong word, one public admission, could destabilize entire networks of authority, and yet, change had begun. By 2015, the act of killing had been screened, unofficially, in every major Indonesian city. NGOs began using it in human rights workshops. Survivors groups expanded. For the first time, a national database of 1965 victims was proposed. It was incomplete, contested, but it was a beginning. Perhaps the most haunting sign of the film's impact came in 2016. During a town hall meeting in Central Java, a man stood up and publicly admitted, through tears, that his father had taken part in the killings. He apologized, to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. The room went silent, and then someone clapped. Not many, but enough, because in a country where silence had once been law, that sound, a single, fragile, human clap, was revolutionary.
Under the Sun. This is a story about a girl named Zinmi, and a country that wanted to control every word she spoke, every breath she took, and every smile she gave. But the real story was hidden in the spaces between the takes, and what no one was supposed to see was exactly what got out. When Russian filmmaker Vitaly Mansky agreed to shoot a documentary inside North Korea, he knew the deal. He would be given a script, a schedule, a hand-picked girl, a factory, a school, a party. Every shot would be approved, every scene would be pre-lit, rehearsed, and orchestrated like theater. His footage would be reviewed every night by government handlers. There would be no improvisation, no questions, no risk. At least that's what they thought. But Mansky had a different plan, a quiet rebellion, built one click at a time. He embedded hidden memory cards inside camera rigs. He kept the camera rolling. After the handlers shouted cut, he filmed the tired faces behind the smiles, the robotic speeches repeated over and over, the small human cracks in the perfect mask, and slowly, quietly, he began to capture something no one else had ever filmed. Not the image of North Korea that the regime projects to the world, but the image of the machine behind the curtain. Zinmi was 8 years old when the film began. She was chosen, we are told, for her purity and enthusiasm. She would be the protagonist of a documentary about a child growing up in the world's most perfect country. Her parents, too, were selected. The father would be promoted to work in a prestigious garment factory. The mother would suddenly become a nutritionist. Everything was scripted, including their professions. their home, and their feelings. We see Zinmi preparing for the day of the shining star, Kim Jong-il's birthday, rehearsing patriotic songs with military precision. Her classroom is spotless, her smile luminous, every frame is manicured. But then, the camera lingers a moment too long. She flinches, her eyes shift, her fingers twist in nervous rhythm. A handler steps in, whispering corrections. "Not like that," he says. "Smile more proudly." This is where the real film begins. What makes Under the Sun so dangerous, so quietly incendiary, is not just what it shows but how it shows it. Every time a scene ends, Mansky keeps filming. Every time a line is delivered, he records the coaching behind it. The regime wants theater. Mansky gives them surveillance. We watch as workers are told exactly when to cheer, as children are ordered to cry with more sincerity, as a soldier pauses in the middle of his lines to ask, "Should I say it more proudly?" We are watching the performance of propaganda and the manufacturing of false consent. In one scene, factory workers are lined up in front of the camera. They chant about their productivity, their loyalty, their honor. Then, cut. A government minder steps in and reads the script out loud, word by word, until the workers memorize it. Their eyes are tired, their uniforms slightly wrinkled, their voices lifeless. Then, action, and the performance begins again. What we're witnessing is not just censorship, it is choreography. And the most terrifying part, everyone knows they are dancing. No one says a word. The smile that doesn't move Sinmi, the young star, is the emotional core of the film. And the most tragic, she is bright. She is obedient. She does everything she's told. But as the film progresses, her mask begins to crack. In one unforgettable sequence, she sits at a table, while government handlers shout instructions at her off camera. "Sit up straighter," they demand. "Speak louder. Smile when you talk about your country." Her smile never reaches her eyes. Later, in a scene meant to show her great happiness, she suddenly breaks into tears. The adults panic. They stop filming. But Mansky secretly does not. He keeps rolling. The handlers swarm her, whispering, bribing, urging. "Don't cry," they say. "Don't ruin the scene." She is 8 years old. She wipes her face. She nods. She tries again. In that moment, the regime's mask slips, not through defiance, but through exhaustion, through the sheer, unbearable weight of forced perfection, and the camera catches it all. Filming took place under constant surveillance. Mansky's every move was tracked. His footage was checked every night by state officials. He would have to hand over all camera cards for inspection, after which he was allowed to resume shooting. But he had a secret system. Each day, his crew used duplicate memory cards. The clean versions were handed over to authorities. The real ones, with raw, unapproved footage, were hidden in plain sight. Some were tucked into camera batteries, others sewn into clothing. At night, the team quietly uploaded clips onto encrypted hard drives, sometimes stashing them behind air vents or inside suitcases. When the shoot ended, and the crew flew back to Moscow, they carried more than just film. They carried stolen moments, truth smuggled out like contraband. What they had captured was unprecedented. Not just the face North Korea wanted to show, but the mechanisms used to maintain that illusion. The handlers, the scripts, the rehearsals, the fatigue, the silence, and behind it all, a child, slowly breaking beneath the weight of a story, not her own. The firestorm when Under the Sun premiered at international festivals. It sent shockwaves through the documentary world. Critics were stunned. How had this been filmed? How had it been smuggled out?
Was it real? The answer, chillingly, was yes. Every shot, every word, every smile had been approved. But the footage between the shots, that was the secret. That was the story. And once it was shown, the regime reacted. North Korea filed an official complaint to Russia, accusing Mansky of fraud, deception, and violation of sovereignty. They demanded the film be banned. They accused him of manipulating a child. State media in Pyongyang declared him an enemy of the people. But it was too late. The film had already screened in Berlin, in Amsterdam, in London, in New York. It spread like wildfire, hailed as one of the most courageous and disturbing documentaries of the decade. And then, Sinmi's family spoke out. In an extraordinary twist, her parents accused Mansky of betrayal. In a letter believed to have been dictated or heavily influenced by the regime, they condemned the film as a distortion of truth and claimed their daughter had been used for political purposes. Sinmi's father, in a trembling voice on state TV, said, "We are heartbroken. This man came to show our country's beauty, and he lied to us. It was tragic, and expected, and deeply painful." Mansky later said in interviews that he never stopped thinking about Sinmi, not just as a symbol, but as a child, a girl caught in a system far beyond her control. She wasn't acting, he said. She was surviving. The Unseen War Under the Sun is not a film about North Korea. It is a film about performance, about fear, about the spaces between sentences, the eyes that flicker before the line is spoken, the smile that stays too long. It's about the cost of pretending, and the pain of being seen. The film doesn't need explosions. It doesn't need escape scenes. Its tension lies in every second. The camera keeps rolling after the world says cut, because that's when the truth appears. Not in the anthem, not in the speech, not in the flag, but in the silence, in the breath before obedience, in the eyes of a child blinking under the weight of the sun. There were those who said the film should never have been made, not because it was false, but because it was too true, because it laid bare a human soul in a cage, because it captured not monsters, but people, ordinary, frightened, exhausted people, trapped in the architecture of a lie so vast it swallowed their thoughts before they could even form them. At universities, film students debated whether it was ethical to keep the camera rolling while a child cried. Journalists questioned whether Mansky had betrayed his subjects or freed them. Some praised the film as revolutionary, others called it a violation. But even the critics couldn't look away. What made Under the Sun unbearable and unforgettable was not what it showed, but what it refused to explain. There is no narrator, no commentary, no expose, just the raw footage. Beautiful, clinical, devastating. You watch Sinmi deliver a speech about her love for Kim Il-sung. You see her eyes flick to the side. You hear a whisper from the darkness, telling her how to pronounce immortal. You see her nod. She tries again. She always tries again. She always tries again. At one screening in Prague, a man in the front row stood up halfway through the film and whispered, "I feel like I'm watching ghosts." A few minutes later, he left the theater, crying, and yet something began to shift. In South Korea, defectors watched the film with clenched fists. Some recognized the schools, the uniforms, the phrases. One man, who had escaped the North at 17, said, "I had forgotten how deep the control went. This brought it all back." He paused, and reminded me why I left. Human rights organizations seized on the film's impact. They began incorporating clips into briefings at the United Nations. It wasn't just documentation, it was evidence. The film showed not only the end result of propaganda, but the process itself, how identities are built, how fear is planted, how reality is rewritten. Diplomats too were shaken. Quietly, behind closed doors, they screened the film for one another. Some admitted, privately, that they had never truly understood North Korea. They had seen parades, weapons tests, speeches, but they had never seen the silence. The small, unbearable silence of a child waiting for permission to speak. Then came the threats. After its release, Mansky began receiving emails, some anonymous, some from known accounts connected to North Korean sympathizers abroad. The tone was always the same. You lied. You will regret this. You destroyed a child's life. Others were more cryptic. The sun watches everyone, but he didn't stop. In interview after interview, Mansky repeated one simple idea, that the film wasn't about betrayal. It was about exposure, about pulling back the velvet curtain and showing the gears behind the spectacle. He compared it to looking at a painting, then turning it over and seeing the thumbprints, the sweat, the pain that built the image. North Korea wanted to be admired from afar, pristine, untouchable, divine. Under the sun was a close-up, and in that closeness, everything cracked. And then just as suddenly, the attention faded. Like all things in the news cycle, the outrage passed. The headlines slowed. The interviews stopped. Sinmi disappeared from public view. Her family was never heard from again. In a country as closed as North Korea, that silence could mean anything, or everything. Years later, a journalist tried to locate her, anonymously, discreetly, through contacts in Beijing and Seoul. They found nothing, no travel record, no change of residence, not even a rumor. It was as if she had vanished back into the frame, swallowed once more by the story written for her. But the film remained. It was taught in classrooms, screened in human rights conferences, quietly passed from filmmaker to filmmaker, often with a kind of reverence, not just for its technical daring, but for its moral complexity. It wasn't just a film about North Korea. It was a film about the cost of silence, about how control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper in the dark, telling a child to smile. Sometimes it's a factory worker memorizing a line he doesn't understand. Sometimes it's a family reading a statement they didn't write, with eyes that beg to look away from the camera. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's a filmmaker pressing record, holding his breath, and refusing to look away. In the end, what Under the Sun showed wasn't just a regime, it was a system of survival. A society sculpted by obedience, a place where truth is not denied, but simply never spoken, and a child, blinking under the weight of expectation, who became, without ever knowing it, the most important witness of all. Even if she never spoke a word that was truly her own, even if the only truth left was silence, Vitaly Mansky never expected to be haunted by a child's silence. But long after the film premiered, after the interviews stopped, after the threats quieted, and the spotlight moved elsewhere, her image stayed with him. Sinmi sitting at her desk, her small hands clenched in her lap, Sinmi blinking under hot studio lights, Sinmi crying without a sound while a dog whispered off camera. She was never supposed to be the story. She was supposed to be a symbol, a backdrop, a piece of choreography in a national performance. Instead, she became the heartbeat of a documentary that changed how the world understood control. But the price was real. Mansky, in interviews years later, described the psychological toll of the shoot, not as a climax, but as a slow grinding erosion. Each day, he said, felt like walking across a frozen lake, listening for cracks. You couldn't speak freely. You couldn't even think freely. Not really. Not when every gesture, every breath, every blink might be watched. And the most disturbing realization, it worked. He admitted that after weeks of filming under such constraints, he himself began to slip into rhythm. He would wake up rehearsing the day's lies. He would nod when the minder spoke, even when he didn't agree. He learned to smile at their corrections, even thank them. The longer he stayed, the more natural the theater became. He began to understand, not just intellectually, but viscerally, how a person can learn to survive within a false reality, and how terrifyingly easy it is. One evening, late into the shoot, a North Korean minder asked Mansky if he liked the food. Yes, he replied, without thinking very much. Only later did he realize the food had made him ill. For days, he had lied without noticing. The performance had become reflex. That was the moment, he later said, when he felt the regime wasn't just outside him, it was inside. The crew too suffered. One assistant, who remained anonymous, said in a confidential documentary that returning home felt like decompression after a hostage situation. They spoke of nightmares, not of violence, but of repetition, of lines being recited over and over, of being watched even in sleep. Some refused to speak publicly at all. The memory was too raw, too confusing. The boundaries between observation and complicity had blurred, because even if they captured the lie, they had helped perform it. Film critics wrestled with the same dilemma. In glowing reviews they often hesitated, even as they praised the bravery of the footage. Was it ethical to expose a child like this? Could Singmi truly have consented? Could anyone under those conditions? Was the camera a witness, or an accomplice? These were not abstract questions. They were wounds, open, bleeding, without easy closure. In one public debate, held at the International Documentary Film Festival Amsterdam, a panel of filmmakers argued bitterly about the film's legacy. One called it a masterpiece of truth-telling. Another said it exploited the innocence of a child for Western catharsis. Neither was entirely wrong, because truth, in Under the Sun, is not clean. It's jagged. It cuts both ways. Even Mansky never pretended to have all the answers. He said again and again that he did what he believed was necessary, that showing the mechanism of manipulation was the only way to break its spell, that the world needed to see what indoctrination looked like, not as a concept, but as a daily ritual. Still, the image of Singmi haunted him. He often wondered what she remembered, whether she knew the film existed, whether she had seen it, or whether it had been buried, like so many truths, beneath layers of silence. He knew he could never return to North Korea. He knew he could never ask her, and yet in a quiet interview years later, he admitted, "If I could speak to her, I would say I'm sorry, not because I regret the film, but because she had no choice." That perhaps is the heart of the story. Not censorship, not propaganda, not even dictatorship, but the absence of choice, the idea that an entire life from birth to death can be scripted by unseen hands, that smiles can be assigned, that dreams can be memorized, that joy itself can be faked, framed, and frozen under the camera's glare. Under the Sun is a film about a lie, but more than that, it is a film about people trying to survive inside that lie. The handlers, the workers, the teachers, the parents, even Singmi herself, all participants in a story they did not write, all trying, in their own way, to remain human under impossible conditions. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Mansky captured most honestly. Not rebellion, not resistance, but humanity, flawed, fragile, flickering like a candle in a room without air, but still trying. And in the end, the camera kept rolling, because that's what cameras do. They capture what shouldn't be seen. They hold still while the world lies. They remember, even when people forget, and sometimes, in rare, painful, necessary moments, they help the rest of us see what truth looks like when it's barely breathing, just a child, just a breath, just a blink, under the sun.
No fire zone. The last days of a war are never quiet, but in Sri Lanka, they were filmed by trembling hands, on dying batteries, through smoke, fire, blood, and silence. This is the story of No Fire Zone, a documentary that does not ask for permission, that doesn't blink when the world turns away. Directed by Scottish filmmaker Callum McRae, it tells a story so brutal, so clear, so undeniable that governments banned it, nations censored it, and war criminals called it a fabrication. And yet, every image is real. In the final phase of Sri Lanka's brutal 26-year civil war, a war fought between the Sri Lankan government and the separatist Tamil Tigers, LTTE, thousands of civilians were trapped inside what the government itself called no-fire zones, places supposedly free from bombing, protected by humanitarian law. But it was a lie. Between January and May of 2009, these zones became death traps. Shells fell every hour, hospitals were flattened, tent cities turned into mass graves, and all the while, the world remained mostly silent until the footage surfaced. It didn't come from journalists. They were banned. It didn't come from drones. There were none. It came from survivors, from volunteers, from former soldiers, from people who pressed record, not to report, but to remember. Mobile phones, tiny cameras, SD cards sewn into clothes and smuggled across checkpoints, and when Macri got hold of it, he knew exactly what it was. Proof, not of war, but of slaughter. In the opening frames of No Fire Zone, the screen is black, then static, a hiss of wind, a child's voice, faint, the camera is shaking. It lifts. We see nothing at first, just blurred grass, a shadow, then a field littered with makeshift tents. Then the camera pans, bodies, not soldiers, not combatants, children, women, men without weapons, slumped, sprawled, some half covered by cloth or leaves. Flies hover. There is no sound but the whine of wind and the soft crush of the cameraman's breath. This is a safe zone, and it is a grave. What makes No Fire Zone so terrifying is not just what it shows, but how it shows it. It does not rely on narration. It doesn't need one. It lets the footage speak. A girl, maybe 10 years old, limps toward a mobile clinic. Her dress is red with blood. She's holding her arm wrong. It's broken, clearly, but she's silent. Her eyes are dry. She walks like someone much older, someone who's seen more than she should. A medic leans over her. The camera wobbles. A shell lands in the distance. No one flinches, because by now, the sound of death is normal. From January to May 2009, over 300,000 Tamil civilians were trapped between government shelling and the last desperate holdouts of the LTTE. The rebels had used civilians as human shields, yes, but the government's response was not surgical, it was relentless. According to UN estimates, as many as 70,000 civilians may have died in those final 5 months, and nearly all of them died in places marked by the government as no-fire zones. The phrase itself, no-fire zone, becomes a grim irony in the film. It appears on maps, on signs, it is repeated in official speeches, and yet, time and again, we see what those zones became: bloodied stretches of earth, shredded by artillery, filled with makeshift tents, burning in slow motion. One sequence shows a hospital, visibly marked with a red cross on the roof, bombed, then bombed again. Doctors scream over patients as the ceiling collapses. Outside, someone films with a handheld camera, the lens smudged by ash. There is no enemy here, only the wounded. The footage in No Fire Zone is not always clean. Some of it is pixelated, much of it shakes, but that's the point. It's real. There's no time for retakes in genocide. Throughout the documentary, we are introduced to survivors, many of them anonymous, their voices disguised or distorted. A man describes carrying his daughter's body across a river. The nurse recalls operating without anesthetic, using sewing needles to close wounds. The teenager remembers hiding in a latrine while shells fell around her, counting to 100, then starting over again. Because if I could count, she says, then I was still alive. In one of the film's most harrowing moments, we see footage of a field execution. The image is grainy, the sound nearly inaudible, but we can see shirtless young men, blindfolded, kneeling. Sri Lankan soldiers stand behind them, laughing. One leans down, says something, perhaps a joke. Then shots, the men collapse, blood soaks into sand. These clips were not leaked by activists. They were filmed by the soldiers themselves, as trophies. The film makes this clear. War crimes were not just committed, they were documented, boasted about, shared. In another clip, soldiers pose beside the corpses of women, some half naked, some clearly assaulted. One soldier nudges a body with his boot and makes a crude remark. Another films. They are smiling. These are not images made for evidence. They are images made for celebration. And still, the Sri Lankan government denied everything. They called the footage fake. They said the images were doctored. They claimed the Tamil Tigers had staged the scenes to gain sympathy. But independent forensic analysts, working with Channel 4 News and Amnesty International, verified the authenticity of the footage. The bullets matched known military calibers. The metadata aligned with time-stamped locations. The voices were traced to real soldiers. Then slowly, the wall began to crack. When No Fire Zone premiered, it was immediately banned. In Sri Lanka, India refused to screen it, fearing diplomatic fallout. The Malaysia censored it under national security grounds. But elsewhere, it spread fast. At the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, the film was screened to diplomats, lawyers, and survivors. The response was visceral. Silence, then fury. Delegates demanded answers. Human rights organizations launched campaigns. Calls for international inquiry grew louder. UK Prime Minister David Cameron, after watching the film, publicly called for an independent investigation. "This footage is deeply disturbing," he said. "There must be justice." But justice, as always, was slow. The Sri Lankan government, under President Mahinda Rajapaksa, doubled down. They rejected all allegations. They accused filmmakers of waging war against the state. They dismissed survivors as enemy sympathizers. They held victory parades, not memorials. And yet, the film remained more than a documentary. It became evidence. The war crimes experts used it to brief the ICC. Lawyers submitted it as material in human rights lawsuits. Activists played it on projectors across refugee camps in India, Malaysia, and beyond. Survivors watched, wept, and pointed at faces they recognized. "I know him," one woman said, her finger trembling. "He shot my husband." The truth, once buried, had a name and a face. By the time the first part of No Fire Zone ends, the viewer is not angry. They are hollowed, because this isn't history. It's a wound, still open, still bleeding, still denied. Then the question that lingers, quietly, mercilessly, is simple. How many no-fire zones still exist in the world today? When a government commits a crime, it often begins by erasing the witnesses. But when the witnesses have cameras, and when those cameras survive, the erasure fails. No Fire Zone did not just document war crimes, it documented the attempt to erase them. And what followed its release was not just controversy, it was a full-scale information war. The Sri Lankan government, under the command of President Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother, Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, responded with rage and precision. Within weeks of the film's first international screenings, Colombo issued formal denials through its embassies. Press releases denounced the documentary as Western propaganda, an LTTE mouthpiece, and a psychological operation designed to defame the brave soldiers who ended terrorism. But they didn't stop at words. They launched an international lobbying campaign, paying millions to PR firms across the UK, the US, and Europe to control the narrative. These firms were tasked with rewriting the story. The Tamil Tigers were painted as the sole aggressors. Civilian deaths were dismissed as unavoidable collateral. The film itself was described as falsified, manipulated, and politically motivated. And yet, the footage said otherwise. No matter how eloquent the government's denials, no matter how polished the press briefings, they could not explain away the image of a naked teenage girl, her body dumped into a ditch,
her face partially blown apart. They could not rationalize the laughter of soldiers standing over fresh corpses. They could not erase the GPS metadata embedded in each clip. So they attacked the filmmakers instead. Callum McRae, the director, was accused of fabricating evidence. He received death threats. His family was targeted online. In one public incident, a Sri Lankan government supporter in Geneva attempted to disrupt a UN screening by screaming at survivors, calling them traitors and terrorists. The moment was caught on camera, and ironically, only drew more attention to the film. McRae did not flinch. Instead, he published every accusation and rebutted it publicly. He posted technical reports, raw footage, timestamps, satellite images. He stood beside survivors in press conferences. "They can attack me all they want," he said, "but they cannot unkill the people who died, and they cannot unfilm what we have shown." The international community began to fracture. Some countries, particularly those with economic ties to Sri Lanka, remained silent. Others, like Canada and Norway, openly condemned the violence. The UK was among the strongest voices, with Prime Minister David Cameron demanding access to the north of Sri Lanka during his 2013 visit. The Sri Lankan government allowed the visit, but only under heavy surveillance. Even then, Tamil citizens ran up to Cameron's convoy with pictures of missing family members, begging for justice. The scenes were broadcast globally, and the silence grew harder to maintain. But within Sri Lanka, the truth remained toxic. The film was banned outright. Police raided homes, suspected of possessing illegal copies. Libraries were searched. Internet cafes were monitored. Even private viewings, whispered about in activist circles, were considered high risk. And still, the film spread. USB drives, Dropbox links, file transfer over Bluetooth, copies smuggled in via Tamil Nadu. It wasn't just a documentary anymore, it was resistance. In one town, a teacher showed the film to her senior class. A week later, she was arrested. No charges were filed. She was simply told to stop. She did not. Instead, she sent the film home with her students on flash drives labeled Math Revision. The government could not censor what they could not catch, but the cost of speaking rose. One survivor, whose face appeared briefly in the documentary, was later abducted. His family never found him. Another activist, who coordinated underground screenings, was beaten and left for dead. The third, an ex-LTTE member, who had publicly denounced the government's atrocities, was found hanged, ruled a suicide by police. But no one believed it, and still, the survivors spoke. At refugee camps in India, Tamil families watched the film and named the dead. They made lists. They recorded testimony. They passed around torn photographs, trying to identify faces captured in the shaky footage. Some recognized children. Others saw parents they thought had vanished without a trace. The most heartbreaking confirmations came from mothers. One by one, they pointed at grainy screenshots. "That's my son," they said. "That's his shirt. That's how he walked. That's where we last saw him." These weren't staged deaths. They weren't CGI. They were people, filmed, dying, forgotten, until now. But the film didn't just uncover the past, it began to impact the future. In 2014, after mounting international pressure, much of it rooted in the evidence provided by No Fire Zone, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed a resolution calling for an independent international investigation into alleged war crimes in Sri Lanka. The government, predictably, refused to cooperate, but the motion passed, and behind the scenes, evidence began to move. Dozens of survivors, ex-soldiers, doctors, and aid workers, inspired by the film, came forward. Some offered testimony under conditions of anonymity. Others offered smuggled documents, photographs, satellite coordinates. A growing archive began to form, hosted securely by international legal teams. One photo showed a date-stamped satellite image of a hospital 2 hours before a shelling. Another contained internal government memos identifying strike zones that included civilian camps. Still another showed intercepted military communication logs, with chilling simplicity that included entries like "Target confirmed, no further civilians visible, proceed." Each document, each image, each voice, they began to close the gaps between the footage and the system that created it. And as the investigation deepened, another revelation emerged. The no-fire zones weren't just ignored by the military, they were deliberately targeted, mapped, calculated, destroyed. The phrase, "no-fire zone," had been used as a trap, a place to concentrate civilians, to deny the presence of combatants, and then to strike without legal consequence. It wasn't just war, it was policy. In legal terms, this changed everything. Suddenly, the question wasn't just whether war crimes had occurred, it was whether crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide, had taken place. The implications were staggering, and the Sri Lankan government knew it, so they escalated. Censorship turned into suppression, suppression into violence, surveillance expanded, dissenters vanished, a culture of fear returned, almost as if the war had never ended, only evolved. And yet, the film remained. By 2015, No Fire Zone had been screened in over 50 countries, translated into 13 languages, and used in human rights tribunals, from Geneva to The Hague. Macrae had become a symbol, not of filmmaking, but of what happens when cameras are turned against power. And still, to this day, some of the footage in the film has never been identified. Unmarked bodies, anonymous voices, flickering shadows in burned-out shelters. They wait for names, for justice, for remembrance. There are some films that change how we see the past. No Fire Zone changed how we see the present. It didn't just tell a story, it created a responsibility, a debt, a wound that once seen cannot be unseen. Years after its release, the footage still circulates, not just among journalists and activists, but in the hands of families still searching for the dead. A mother in Jaffna watches the film every year. On her son's birthday, she pauses at a frame. She rewinds, pauses again. "He moved like that," she says. "That's how he stood." She cannot prove it's him, but she knows this is what memory becomes in the aftermath of mass violence. Fragments, frames, grainy truths, held together by grief. And for the Tamil survivors of Sri Lanka's civil war, No Fire Zone remains the most visible, painful, and powerful archive of what was lost, and what the world chose not to see in time. In the years following the UN resolution in 2014, the call for justice grew louder, but justice itself remained distant. The Rajapaksa brothers were voted out of power in 2015, replaced by a coalition that promised truth and reconciliation. For a moment, there was hope. A few symbolic gestures followed. Commissions were created, documents collected, apologies whispered, but none of the perpetrators were prosecuted. Not one. Then, in 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the man under whose authority the final offensive was waged, was elected president. He ran on a platform of patriotism, national security, and military pride. He won by a landslide, and for the survivors, it felt like the war had restarted. Under his administration, memorials to Tamil victims were dismantled. Families of the disappeared were harassed. Activists were detained. The legal language of reconciliation vanished. What replaced it was silence. Again, but this time, there were copies, USB drives, cloud backups, interviews, testimonies, and No Fire Zone. The film became more than a record. It became resistance in the form of memory. Internationally, it shaped how war journalism is practiced today. Young filmmakers and reporters now study its structure, not just the footage, but the ethics, how to verify shaky clips, how to preserve digital metadata, how to protect witnesses. It has become a textbook for justice, one that was never written, only film. New platforms, from forensic architecture to Bellingcat, cite the documentary as a turning point, a moment when grassroots footage, combined with legal rigor, became more powerful than satellite images or state reports. Even the International Criminal Court now accepts mobile phone footage as admissible, a direct consequence of No Fire Zone and the movement it inspired. But for the Tamil diaspora, the film is not a case study. It is a funeral, unfinished, incomplete, ongoing. In London, Toronto, Sydney, and Paris, thousands of Tamils gather each year, on May 18th, the day the war officially ended, to mourn. They light candles, they recite names, and they screen the film, sometimes outdoors, sometimes in churches or community centers. It plays not as a documentary, but as proof of life and of death. One young man, whose parents fled Sri Lanka in 2009, said he grew up watching the film in secret. My mother couldn't speak about what happened, he said, but when she watched the film, she finally cried. That was his first memory of her tears. For others, the film is the only remaining connection to lost loved ones. There are faces in the footage, half buried, fleeting, blurred by motion, that no database can name. But for the families, those seconds are everything. They tried to erase us, said one survivor, but now they can't. We are here, in the films. Still the question remains, will there ever be justice? The international community has not forgotten. The UN continues to monitor Sri Lanka. Human rights organizations keep publishing reports. But political will is fragile. Evidence fades. Witnesses age. The world's attention drifts to new conflicts. And so survivors, those still standing, still searching, carry the burden forward. Many of them now live in exile. Some run NGOs. Some teach. Some simply endure. All of them remember. And they carry the footage like a second heartbeat. Callum McCrae, years after finishing the film, admitted that he often asked himself the same question. Was it enough? He said the footage haunted him. The voices, the images, the knowledge that he had seen something that most people would never face. And he knew the film would not undo the deaths. It could not bring children back. It could not rebuild burned villages or unbreak bones. But it could remember, and maybe, just maybe, it could force others to remember too. That in the end is what No Fire Zone became. Not a movie, not even a documentary, but a refusal to look away, a refusal to accept silence, a refusal to forget. There are stories that governments try to bury, truths too dangerous for textbooks, names erased from memorials, bodies left unnamed. These stories live in the shadows until someone finds the light. No Fire Zone was that light, flickering, unstable, but real. And now, no matter who denies it, no matter how many times they rewrite the narrative, the footage survives. In memory cards, in archives, in the eyes of the girl filmed crying behind a tent, in the hands of the boy holding a shredded passport, in the silence between shelves, and in the space where a safe zone was promised, but never came. Because the last words of the film are not spoken, they are shown. A mother's face, a shattered school, a field where flowers should grow, but don't, and across the screen, the same phrase that haunts every frame: No Fire Zone.
Earthlings. When Earthlings was quietly released in 2005, there were no red carpets, there were no streaming deals, no morning show interviews, no corporate sponsors. The footage was too graphic, the message too uncomfortable, and the consequences, if people actually watched it, too unpredictable. So it spread in silence, from hard drives, torrents, anonymous links in online forums, burned DVDs passed between friends. Activists screened it in basements, in classrooms, in parking lots. After protests, they projected it on the walls of slaughterhouses. Some even sent unmarked copies to government officials and celebrities, hoping, praying, that someone powerful would watch and speak. Many didn't, but those who did were changed. One viewer wrote, "I started the film with a bowl of chicken soup. Halfway through, I threw it away. I haven't eaten meat since." Another, "It felt like I was looking into a mirror I never knew existed, and suddenly I saw what I truly was." The film didn't just make people feel sad, it made them feel complicit. It didn't ask them to care, it told them they already did. They'd just been hiding it, because every image in Earthlings is tethered not to some abstract notion of cruelty, but to products we recognize: a burger, a belt, a circus ticket, a lipstick, a drug. The film dares the viewer to trace the bloodline of convenience, and what it finds at the other end is not ignorance, but willful forgetting, and that forgetting had a cost. Psychologists later coined the term Earthlings effect to describe the acute emotional reaction viewers had to the film, not just disgust, but grief, shame, identity crisis. Some reported nightmares, others couldn't eat for days, many cried, a few vomited, a surprising number began therapy, and yet they shared it. Even those who couldn't bear to finish it passed it on. It became a test, a badge, a rite of passage in activist circles. Have you watched Earthlings? I tried. I couldn't. But you know what it shows? I do. I can't unknow. That was the real genius of the film. It didn't just show abuse. It tore open the firewall between our choices and their consequences. And once that connection was made, there was no going back. The narration, delivered in low, mournful tones by Joaquin Phoenix, was not sensational. It was solemn, almost priestly. He didn't yell. He didn't blame. He simply described. The horror of this film, Phoenix later said in an interview, is not in what I say. It's in what the camera captures. I just speak the names of the things we try not to name. Phoenix, already known for his emotionally immersive roles, had been a long-time vegan and activist, but Earthlings became one of his most personal projects. He was not paid. He did not promote it on talk shows. He treated it not as a performance, but as a responsibility. Later, when he accepted his Academy Award for Joker, Phoenix used the global spotlight not to thank producers, but to speak, trembling, about injustice, about mothers and calves being separated, about domination, and the human illusion of supremacy. He never said the name of the film that first gave him this voice. He didn't need to. Millions knew. Earthlings had become a kind of mythic artifact, rarely seen in public, whispered about, feared. It was the film people watched alone, with headphones, with the lights off, and the door closed, because it forced intimacy with things we push to the periphery of modern life: death, suffering, power, dependency, the industrialized conversion of living beings into units of profit. It did not ask, do you care about animals? It asked, how do you live with yourself knowing this? It became a global turning point for the animal rights movement. Before Earthlings, veganism was often seen as niche, strange, even extreme. After Earthlings, it became ethical, urgent, human. Organizations like PETA, Mercy for Animals, and Anonymous for the Voiceless began incorporating the film into their outreach. Not just clips, the whole thing. Activists set up laptop screens in public squares with signs that read, "We'll pay you to watch this," and people did. In one study, over 70% of viewers who watched the film in full reported making immediate changes to their diets. Over 40% reported lasting behavioral transformation 6 months later. Activists knew. They didn't need to argue. They just needed people to watch. Even in religious circles, the film found a strange resonance. Buddhists quoted it in Dharma talks. Progressive Christians used it in ethics classes. Some Hindu temples banned leather shoes at the door after screening it for their congregations. For faiths that preached compassion, the film was a mirror held to their choices. And still, despite the wave of impact, most major platforms refused to host it. Netflix declined. HBO never touched it. Major broadcasters in the US, Europe, and Asia cited excessive graphic content as the reason. Not that it was false, just unbearable. So the film lived on the margins, and in doing so kept its power. It never went mainstream. It went viral, and in that virality,
It shaped minds more deeply than any blockbuster could. At vegan festivals around the world, people gather not just to celebrate food or lifestyle, but to share a memory, a wound, an awakening. Someone always says, "Earthlings changed everything for me." And there's always someone else who nods, slowly, in silent agreement, because Earthlings did not ask to be a movement. It became one, not through slogans, but through truth, through footage dragged out of back rooms and cages, through voices we weren't supposed to hear, through the stillness of a skinned animal blinking once before the screen fades to black. This is the kind of film that breaks the fourth wall not with technique, but with morality. It does not entertain. It indicts. And when it's over, the room is never quite the same. The true legacy of Earthlings was never about awards, distribution, or box office. It was about what people did after they watched it. For some it meant never eating meat again. For others it meant giving up fur, leather, or animal-tested cosmetics. For a growing number, it meant something deeper, a philosophical shift, an awakening, a permanent break from the comforting illusions of modern life, and a turn toward radical empathy. This shift rippled far beyond personal lifestyle. After Earthlings, the animal rights movement didn't just grow, it transformed. Activists no longer appealed merely to environmentalism or health. They now had the footage, the sounds, the screams, the facts, and they used them. Campaigns became more confrontational. Street activism rose sharply. Cube of Truth demonstrations, where activists in Guy Fawkes masks display footage from Earthlings and similar documentaries, became a global phenomenon. From Warsaw to São Paulo, Tokyo to Johannesburg, public squares turned into silent witness spaces. In those silent screens, Earthlings lived on. Meanwhile, new documentaries, Dominion, Unity, Seaspiracy, followed its path, but all of them, without exception, stood in the shadow of Sean Monson's work. They owed it their structure, their severity, their willingness to face pain without cutting away, and slowly, systems began to shift. In the years following the film's rise, several countries introduced new legislation to protect animals in labs, farms, and shelters. The European Union expanded its ban on animal-tested cosmetics. California outlawed the sale of fur. Major corporations like IKEA, Nestlé, and Unilever began phasing out cages in their supply chains, not out of generosity, but under pressure was born from people who had seen Earthlings, and could no longer eat without remembering, could no longer shop without wondering, could no longer sleep without asking, what else am I ignoring? The food industry, once immune to ethical scrutiny, felt the shift. Plant-based markets exploded. Vegan meat alternatives, once fringe, entered every major supermarket. Chains like Burger King, McDonald's, and KFC scrambled to offer cruelty-free options. It wasn't ideology. It was demand. Demand rooted in information. And that information had a face. Earthlings. But the most profound legacy of the film may be the one hardest to quantify. It lives in the quiet, in the hand that reaches to pet a dog, and now recognizes the pig, the cow, the chicken as the same, in the family who sits down to dinner and sees more than food, in the teenager who walks out of the classroom, mouth dry, after watching the film on a borrowed projector, and never forgets what they saw, because Earthlings planted something dangerous. Conscience. It asked not, what are the laws, or what are the facts? It asked, what does it mean to be kind? And it never answered. It just showed. That's what gave it power. and why the industries it exposed worked so hard to discredit it. In internal memos leaked years later, executives from meat and fashion lobbies listed Earthlings as a high-impact threat. They didn't fear it because it lied. They feared it because it didn't, because it gave people what corporations try desperately to avoid: transparency. No euphemisms, no filters, no ambient music to soften the blow, just cages, chains, blades, blood, and silence. That silence, carefully chosen by Sean Monson, became its own form of protest. Unlike many documentaries, Earthlings refuse to end on a hopeful montage. There are no upbeat statistics, no happy animals skipping into the sunset. There is just the final statement: make the connection. 3 words, 1 demand. And yet, so much has changed because of them. Schools began including animal ethics in curricula. Philosophy departments revisited the ideas of speciesism and moral hierarchy. Animal sentience, once debated, is now widely accepted by scientists, governments, and courts. The legal status of animals began to shift from property to personhood, with landmark rulings in Argentina, India, and the US recognizing individual animals as legal subjects. None of this was inevitable. It came from pressure, from awareness, from eyes opened wide, and hearts unwilling to look away, from people who saw Earthlings, and chose not to forget. And still, new viewers discover the film every day, often alone, often late at night, often with one hand hovering over the pause button, unsure if they're ready to see. Some don't finish it, but most, once they begin, don't walk away unchanged. Because it's not just the images, it's the invitation to feel, to imagine, to remember that animals, the ones we breed, buy, cage, wear, eat, test, ignore, are not commodities. They are Earthlings, just like us. And in that shared identity lies the most dangerous truth of all. There is no ethical line between the abuser and the consumer, unless we draw it ourselves. No government will do it for us. No market will offer it voluntarily. Only we can decide what kind of species we want to be. And for many, that decision began with a flickering screen, a slow voice, and a final image of a skinned animal blinking into the lens, not in fear, but in recognition. Because even in pain, even in death, even in silence, they saw us. And now, we've seen them. It begins not with a scream, but with a silence. A silence so wide, so long, so carefully maintained, that most of us never even noticed it was there. Earthlings, directed by Sean Monson, and narrated in haunting tones by Joaquin Phoenix, is not a film that entertains. It is a film that wounds, and refuses to let that wound close. It is not a story told with characters and arcs, but with evidence, hidden footage, and raw truths, that humanity has locked behind fences, beneath factory roofs, and inside refrigerated trucks that no one follows when they leave the slaughterhouse. This is the film that people avoid. And that's exactly why it matters. Using hidden cameras, smuggled into the heart of 5 industries: pets, food, fashion, entertainment, and scientific research. Earthlings does not ask for your opinion. It removes it. It strips away distance and defense, and replaces them with images so visceral, so undeniable, that your own body becomes the battleground between what you see and what you can no longer pretend not to know. Because Earthlings doesn't show us monsters, it shows us ourselves. The film opens with a simple, almost clinical premise. Human beings use animals for food, clothing, companionship, entertainment, and scientific progress. These categories are familiar, comforting, even. Everyone has seen a pet store, worn leather, watched a circus, eaten a burger. But what we haven't seen, what we've been carefully shielded from, is how these systems operate, and what they cost. In the first sequence, the screen is almost black. A dog stares through metal bars, eyes wide. Behind him, rows and rows of cages, puppies, huddled in corners, birds with clipped wings, cats with distended bellies. This is not a shelter. It's a warehouse, a pet factory. And just as quickly, the scene cuts to the disposal area. Unwanted animals, unsold, sick or aging, being loaded into trucks, some still moving, none making a sound. Because Earthlings wastes no time, reminding us the pet industry is not a haven. It's a business, and its byproduct is death. Puppy mills, breeding cages, backyard facilities where dogs are chained their entire lives, used solely for reproduction, cats in plastic bins, ferrets in labs, rabbits in sealed cages, twitching under heat lamps. Monson does not zoom in for effect. He holds the shot, steady, unforgiving. Phoenix's narration is deliberate, almost too calm. This is not unusual, he says. This is standard. And you believe him. Because the camera does not blink. Soon the footage shifts. We enter the food industry. A chicken is hung upside down on a mechanical line. She flaps weakly. Then the blade comes. The blood hits the metal like water on glass. Thousands follow her. Beaks open, wings flailing. Then pigs. A worker uses an electric prod to force one into a pen. The pig slips, screams, tries to back away. Another worker kicks it in the face. A third slams the gate shut. Then the gas. In the next shot, cows are being branded. A searing iron presses into their flesh. Their bodies convulse. Then come the dehorning, the castration, the transport. Calves taken from mothers within hours of birth. The sound of a mother cow, mourning, deep, guttural, endless, echoes long after the screen cuts away. Phoenix says nothing. He doesn't have to. In slaughterhouses, often hidden in remote areas, or tucked behind innocuous walls, the real machinery is not metal, it's denial, efficiency, distance. Workers operate on quotas. They are trained to move quickly, not gently. One scene shows a live cow being skinned. Her eyes are open, her head turns. The camera doesn't flinch. And this is what made Earthlings unbroadcastable. No major network would touch it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true, too raw, too close, too damning. There was no way to watch and explain it away. The fashion industry sequence begins with fur, foxes, minks, and raccoons bred in captivity, kept in wire cages, then electrocuted, or bludgeoned to preserve their pelts. A worker steps on a raccoon dog's neck and begins to skin him, while the animal is still alive. You can see the eyes move. You can see the tongue flicker. When the body is dumped, it blinks. Again, there's no voiceover. There is no need. Leather, too, is exposed. Many assume it is a byproduct of the meat industry. But Earthlings shows that in places like India and China, leather comes from animals deliberately tortured to produce softer hides. Cattle forced to walk hundreds of miles without water, beaten with sticks, dragged by trucks when they collapse. All of it hidden behind labels and storefronts that say genuine, Italian, premium. The film then moves into the world of entertainment. Circuses, knows marine parks. Footage shows elephants beaten with hooks during training. Their cries are unmistakable, deep, sharp, completely at odds with their size. Trainers smile, audiences clap. A bear is made to dance, his feet scorched by hot metal to force the movement. Monkeys in chains, tigers pacing in cages so small they can't turn. None of it is accidental. It's tradition, spectacle, economics. Children cheer while animals break. And then comes the laboratory. White coats, latex gloves, scalpel tape. Here the narration returns in full. Phoenix reads government documents outlining the legal framework that allows animals to be tested on without pain relief, as long as it is deemed scientifically necessary. The footage shows beagles forced to inhale cigarette smoke through masks, rabbits having chemicals dripped into their eyes, primates screaming as electrodes are implanted into their skulls. Some of these images were smuggled out at great personal risk. Activists hid cameras in ceiling panels, disguised themselves as workers. Some were arrested, others received threats. One lab technician turned whistleblower after seeing a chimpanzee, who had been raised by humans, beg with hand gestures to be released. No one listened. Until now. Earthlings is not a film that ends with resolution. It doesn't wrap itself in optimism or offer a neat solution. It ends where it begins, with silence, with a simple brutal fact that all of this continues, that the animals shown are not exceptions, they are examples. The power of the film lies not just in its footage, but in its audience. People who watched it reported going vegan overnight. Others described feeling physically ill. Some refused to finish. And some, perhaps the most honest, simply said they could never forget what they saw. Because that's what Earthlings does. It removes the luxury of ignorance. It breaks the distance. It puts the knife, the branding iron, the whip, the gas chamber, in our hands. And then it asks, now that you know, what will you do?
Fahrenheit 9/11. It begins, not with an explosion, but with a handshake, a warm smile, a camera flash, an agreement sealed, not in back rooms, but in broad daylight. And for years, no one thought to question it, until Michael Moore did. Fahrenheit 9/11, released in the summer of 2004, wasn't just a documentary. It was a Molotov cocktail lobbed into the carefully staged theater of American patriotism, fear, and foreign policy, and it blew open a door the public had been told didn't even exist. This wasn't about conspiracy theories. It was about documented facts, conflicts of interest, suppressed investigations, financial trails connecting the Bush family to Saudi royalty, entire planes of Saudi nationals, including relatives of Osama bin Laden, being allowed to fly out of the United States, while every American airport remained on lockdown. How? Why? Who approved it? That's where Moore pointed his camera, and what he captured would change political filmmaking forever. From the very first seconds, Fahrenheit 9/11 subverts expectation. We don't see flames or planes or screaming news anchors. We see silence, darkness, and then a slow, almost surgical dissection of how we got there. Was it all just a dream? Moore's voice asks. The screen shows George W. Bush being declared president, not by votes, but by the Supreme Court, in one of the most controversial legal decisions in U.S. history. The year is 2000, the election, still bitterly contested, and then, the pivot, September 11th, 2001, the towers fall, the nation weeps, and as the country reels, the Bush administration begins moving, swiftly, decisively, but not always visibly. Within hours, they're coordinating evacuation flights, not for American citizens, but for Saudi elites. 15 of the 19 hijackers that day were Saudi nationals, yet it was Iraq that would burn. The film takes viewers down a rabbit hole of financial entanglements that mainstream outlets had barely touched. The Carlyle Group, a defense contractor and investment firm, counted both George H.W. Bush and members of the bin Laden family among its investors. Moore lays it out with almost unbearable calm. The war on terror wasn't just a political crusade, it was a business venture. Oil, arms, reconstruction, and at the center, a web of relationships stretching from Washington, D.C. to Riyadh. But the most disturbing part, it wasn't hidden, it was simply ignored. Fahrenheit 9/11 peels back not only the actions of the Bush administration, but the blind complicity of the media. Anchors cheerlead invasions, senators pass sweeping war powers without reading the bills. The Patriot Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that gutted civil liberties, is passed with barely a whisper of debate. Small walks through the Capitol, stopping lawmakers and asking them a simple question: did you read the Patriot Act before voting for it? Most smile awkwardly, none say yes. The film blends sharp satire with cold reality. One moment, we're watching troops in Iraq pump themselves up with heavy metal and adrenaline before kicking indoors. The next we see their mothers, grieving, bewildered, still believing the official story, until their children don't come home. That juxtaposition is what gives Fahrenheit 9/11 its power. Moore doesn't scream. He doesn't need to. He shows a teacher reading to children, Bush sitting silently, after being told America is under attack, not acting, not reacting, just sitting. Then the longer the camera lingers, the more unbearable it becomes, because in that moment, time doesn't just freeze, it fractures, and America begins spiraling into a war it wasn't ready for, led by a man who, according to the film, may have had reasons beyond revenge or defense, reasons tied to oil fields, to defense contracts, to Saudi loyalty. Moore traces the narrative like a detective at a crime scene. Flight logs, memos, archived interviews, public statements that contradict each other. It's not hidden, it's everywhere, but no one had connected the dots until now, and when they are connected, a new picture emerges, not of accidental misjudgment, but of carefully choreographed misdirection. Moore interviews soldiers, some angry, some broken. He visits Flint, Michigan, his hometown, where young men and women enlist not out of patriotism, but poverty. The military, he argues, preys on the poor, while the rich get richer off war. One recruiter laughs on camera, explaining how he targets kids at shopping malls and poor neighborhoods. This is where the good ones are, he says, the good ones, the disposable ones. Back in Washington, lobbyists dine, defense stocks rise, the war drags on, and the country, numbed by fear and patriotism, stops asking questions, until this film, and even then, many refused to listen. Disney, which owned Miramax at the time, tried to block the film's release. Executives feared it would alienate conservative audiences, threaten tax deals in Florida, and bring unnecessary controversy. But Harvey Weinstein and the Weinstein brothers pushed it through, fighting behind the scenes, to ensure the film saw daylight. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, and received the longest-standing ovation in the festival's history. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood, they wept, they understood. Within weeks, Fahrenheit 9/11 was banned in Kuwait, and censored in Saudi Arabia. Conservative media in the US called it treasonous. Politicians fumed, talk show hosts raged, and audiences flooded in. It became the highest-grossing documentary of all time, earning $23.9 million on its opening weekend alone. Packed theaters, gasps, walkouts, applause, protests. It was not a film you simply watched, it was a film you experienced, and once you had, you couldn't unsee it. Moore never claimed to be neutral, he never pretended to be a reporter. He was a citizen, furious, grieving, and demanding answers, and that authenticity, mixed with his dark humor and meticulous research, made the film hit harder than any press conference ever could. It showed us what we didn't want to believe, that in the fog of tragedy, some people found opportunity, and took it. Fahrenheit 9/11 holds its final frames, like a held breath. A child cries, a mother weeps, a flag waves, and then silence, not because the story is over, but because it's still happening. When Fahrenheit 9/11 hit American theaters in the summer of 2004, it didn't just break records,
It shattered illusions. For some it was confirmation, for others, betrayal. For many, it was the first time they had seen the war, the politics, and the presidency presented not with reverence, but with relentless scrutiny. It was a mirror, and not everyone liked the reflection. The backlash was immediate. Conservative pundits called it propaganda. Fox News ran entire segments attacking Michael Moore's credibility. Talk radio hosts accused him of hating America. Protesters stood outside cinemas, with signs reading "Traitor" and "Support our troops, not more." Some theaters refused to screen the film. Others received bomb threats. Moore meanwhile became a target, not just of words but of surveillance. It later emerged that the Bush administration had monitored him. He spoke publicly about mysterious figures tailing his vehicle, about attempts to hack into his website, about hate mail that arrived daily by the boxload. He doubled his security detail. He refused to back down. On his national speaking tour, Moore faced hecklers, sabotage attempts and death threats, but the audiences kept growing. Young voters packed into auditoriums. Veterans approached him in tears. Parents who had lost children in Iraq asked if he could help them speak out. It was no longer just a film tour, it was a resistance movement on wheels. As the 2004 presidential election loomed, Fahrenheit 9/11 became an unexpected political weapon. Democrats praised the film, though often cautiously, fearful of being labeled anti-military. Pride Republicans denounced it wholesale. Some even attempted to launch counterfilms, hastily produced documentaries with names like Celsius 41.11, trying to discredit Moore's work. None of them stuck, because the footage in Fahrenheit 9/11 wasn't speculation. It was archival, verified, and damning. The Bush campaign, sensing the growing threat, went into overdrive. They painted the film as Hollywood fiction. They released ads celebrating Bush's strong leadership. They flooded media outlets with veterans endorsing the war, but behind closed doors they were worried. Polls showed that among undecided voters who watched the film, support for Bush dropped significantly. Entire college campaigns sprang up around the film. Activists handed out free tickets. Grassroots organizers used it to mobilize the largest youth voter turnout in decades. And yet, Bush won re-election. Despite the furor, the film's record-breaking run, the protests, the questions, the war continued. The surveillance state expanded. The lies, many of them now exposed, were never punished. This was perhaps the most haunting outcome of Fahrenheit 9/11. Not that it failed, but that it succeeded, and still changed so little. Moore later said, "I thought if people knew the truth they'd rise up. I thought a camera would be enough. It wasn't." And that became the film's second legacy. The first was exposure. The second, disillusionment. Not in the government, but in democracy itself. The realization that information alone doesn't bring justice. That truth doesn't always win. That sometimes, even when the curtain is pulled back, the show goes on. But Moore didn't stop. After the film he kept filming, kept asking, kept confronting. In 2007 he released Sicko, targeting the healthcare industry. In 2018, Fahrenheit 11/9, aimed at the Trump presidency. But none of them shook the world the way Fahrenheit 9/11 did, because it came at a moment when America was still raw, still reeling, still scared, and it dared to say, "Look closer." In classrooms the film became a tool for debate. In activist spaces, a rallying cry. In military households, a fracture between duty and doubt. Some veterans said it helped them understand why they came back broken. Others called it anti-American. Friendships ended over it. Marriages strained. Viewers walked out in tears, in anger, in silence. It was that rarest of cinematic creations, a film that mattered, not because of who made it, but because of what it revealed. In the years since, many of its claims have been quietly confirmed. The 9/11 Commission report, though incomplete, acknowledged intelligence failures, Leaked cables confirmed that Saudi ties were downplayed. Subsequent reports revealed the Bush administration had cherry-picked intelligence to justify war. Moore had not fabricated the truth, he had uncovered it early. The media, once his harshest critics, began quoting his findings. By 2020, with wars still smoldering, surveillance still legal, and billions still being funneled into defense, the questions Fahrenheit 9/11's asked felt more relevant than ever. Who benefits? Who decides? Who pays? The film ends with images of loss, firefighters in rubble, mothers at funerals, soldiers walking into smoke. There is no music, no catharsis, just a voice, Michael Moore asking, if nobody asks why, then nothing will ever change. And that in the end is Fahrenheit 9/11's most enduring message. Not rage, not blame, but insistence. That we ask, that we look, that we never again accept silence as safety.
The Cove, it begins with a man being followed, not in a war zone, not in a dictatorship, but in Japan, in a small, quiet seaside town that looks like something from a watercolor painting, peaceful, calm, until you ask the wrong question. Then the shadows start to move, cameras appear where there were none before, cars idle too long, men with polite smiles linger just a few steps too close, phones click even when no one is speaking. You feel it before you see it. You're not welcome here. And that's when Rico Barry knew he was getting close. The Cove, directed by Louis Pichot, isn't just a documentary. It's an exposé disguised as a heist film. It tells the story of one of the most brutal and well-hidden slaughters of marine life on the planet. Not for survival, not for tradition, but for profit, dose. And it takes us straight into the heart of a conspiracy so deeply embedded in local and governmental systems that filming it required military-grade surveillance equipment, covert operations, and round-the-clock surveillance countermeasures. The target, a single cove in Taiji, Japan, beautiful, isolated, hidden, and soaked in blood. Every year, from September through March, thousands of dolphins are driven into this narrow inlet. Fishermen use sound, banging on metal poles underwater to create a wall of noise that disorients the dolphins' sonar. Terrified and confused, the dolphins swim toward what they believe is safety. They find a trap. Some are selected for marine parks, sold to aquariums around the world for up to $150,000 apiece. These are the lucky ones. The rest are slaughtered with spears and knives, turning the turquoise water crimson. It's methodical, industrial, and completely concealed. No tourists ever see it. No locals speak of it. No cameras are allowed. That's where Pichot and his team came in. A former National Geographic photographer, Pichot wasn't new to secrets, but nothing had prepared him for the layers of resistance they encountered in Taiji. Attempts to film were met with harassment. Local police monitored every step. One crew member was arrested. Another was threatened. Every hotel room was bugged. Every rental car was tailed. So they went underground. They built hidden cameras disguised as rocks. They installed infrared night vision rigs in the hills. They operated like a military unit. Scouts, divers, lookouts, decoys. Because they weren't just filming a documentary, they were infiltrating a crime scene in real time. And the risks weren't theoretical. Japanese authorities had previously warned journalists and activists to stay away. Undercover attempts had failed. One local activist, after speaking to the media, was found beaten in an alley. Others simply disappeared from public view. But the team pressed on. At the center of it all was Rico Barry, a man with his own ghosts. He had once been the most successful dolphin trainer in the world. He captured and trained the 5 dolphins who played Flipper in the 1960s television series, the show that launched the global marine park industry. He was part of the illusion, the smiling dolphin, the friendly splash, the childlike intelligence. But one day, One of the dolphins, Kathy, died in his arms. She stopped breathing, by choice, and in that moment, Rick understood. Captivity kills. He's been trying to undo his life's work ever since. In the Cove, we follow Rick back into the heart of the machine he helped build. Only now, he's trying to burn it down. There is a scene where Rick walks the edge of the Taiji coast at dawn, knowing the slaughter is happening behind the tarps. He can hear the metal poles banging, the dolphins' cries, but all he can do is stand and listen. You feel his helplessness in your bones. You want to scream with him, but screaming doesn't work here. That's why they built the cameras. The footage they captured, after weeks of preparation and sleepless nights, is among the most devastating ever seen in a documentary. In complete silence, night vision cameras show dolphins being herded into the narrow cove. Then in the early morning light, the slaughter begins. Men wade into the water with long metal poles and knives. The dolphins thrash. You hear the splash of water, then blood. So much blood. It spreads like ink. Thick, dark, alive. One dolphin tries to leap over the nets. Another slams into the rock wall. Some cry, high-pitched keening sounds that echo in your skull, long after the screen cuts to black. And then, stillness. The men drag the bodies onto boats. The water clears. The next group is already being driven in. And until this film, no one outside that cove had ever seen it. But this wasn't just about cruelty. It was about corruption. The town of Taiji didn't just hide the slaughter. They sold the meat to schools and grocery stores, labeling it as whale, and distributing it without warning. But dolphin meat is toxic. It contains dangerously high levels of mercury, levels far exceeding international safety limits. Children in Taiji were being poisoned, and the government knew. Local officials dismissed the data. They denied the mercury. They denied the source. They denied the slaughter. When confronted on camera, one official laughs. People in Taiji eat dolphin. So what? But it wasn't just about tradition. This was business. Behind every dead dolphin was a contract. A buyer, a market, an aquarium in Dubai, a marine park in China, a swim with dolphins program in the Caribbean, and every smiling tourist snapping a selfie with a captive dolphin. They were funding the kill. That's what the Cove exposed. Not just the blood, but the money trail. And once the film was released, the silence broke. Audiences around the world were stunned. People gasped, walked out in tears. Some vomited. Others demanded answers. Animal rights groups mobilized. Protests erupted outside Japanese embassies. Petitions were launched. The hashtag #SaveDolphins trended for months. Japan's response: censorship, silence, denial. The film was banned from most cinemas. Journalists who covered it were blacklisted. Local officials refused interviews. And yet, the images spread. Clips appeared on YouTube, shared in secret. USB drives were mailed into Japan. Activists projected the film on the walls of city halls. In Tokyo, a group of students held a silent screening on the subway, playing the film on tablets for anyone who looked. Because the Cove wasn't just a film, it was evidence, and the world could no longer pretend it didn't know. The footage didn't just expose a crime, it ignited a war. After the Cove premiered at Sundance, and later took home the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, the ripple effect was immediate and brutal. For the first time, the world had not just heard about dolphin slaughter in Japan, it had seen it, in full color, in infrared, from multiple angles. There was no allegedly, no deniability. There was just blood, screams, and truth. And Japan was furious. The Japanese government publicly condemned the film. Officials called it misleading, culturally insensitive, manipulative. They accused the filmmakers of trespassing,
of espionage, of exploiting a local tradition without understanding its context. But what they didn't do, and couldn't do, was deny the footage itself, so they turned inward. In Taiji, authorities increased security. Barriers were raised around the cove. No trespassing signs in English and Japanese sprouted overnight. Local fishermen began patrolling the area themselves, armed with cameras, drones, in some cases clubs. Tourists were treated as potential spies. Foreigners were followed. Hotels refused bookings. Locals stopped talking to the press. Activists arriving in Taiji were met at the train station by polite but unwavering police escorts, who accompanied them everywhere. Rico Barry returned again and again. Each time he was shadowed, questioned, detained. Once he was arrested, but he never stopped. "It's not about me," he said in an interview. "It's about the dolphins. I will go back every year until this ends." And he did. Every September, as the killing season reopened, O'Barry stood on the hill above the cove, holding signs, handing out flyers, silently witnessing the horror once more. Around him, a movement grew. Protests spread to London, Sydney, Berlin, Toronto. People gathered outside Japanese embassies dressed in dolphin costumes, covered in red paint, holding signs that read, "You can't silence the sea." In 2010, activists from Sea Shepherd arrived in Taiji with boats and cameras. They live-streamed dolphin hunts. They broadcast license plates. They filmed injured dolphins being dumped at sea. Every year, more volunteers came. Some were arrested. Some were attacked. All of them kept coming back, because the cove had given them a purpose and a mission, and something else had begun to shift. Aquariums started to panic. The footage forced the public to ask questions they had never asked before. Where do these dolphins come from? What happens before they arrive? Why are they smiling? The answer: their not devastated the marine entertainment industry. Attendance at marine parks began to decline. Swim with dolphins tours came under scrutiny. Customers demanded sourcing information. Celebrities pulled their support. In 2013, Blackfish would build on this wave, exposing the cruelty behind orca captivity. But the Cove was the first blow. Countries responded. India banned dolphin captivity entirely, declaring dolphins non-human persons, with rights to life and freedom. Costa Rica followed. Croatia, Chile, Slovenia. Dozens of nations reviewed their practices, scrutinizing where their dolphins came from, and where they had disappeared to. All roads led to Taiji, but the town refused to change. Backed by the Japanese fishing lobby and local government support, the hunt continued. More secretive, more guarded, but no less brutal. Still, the international pressure grew harder to ignore. In 2014, the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, BOAZA, suspended the Japanese Zoo Association for obtaining dolphins from Taiji. It was a landmark decision, and it worked. Japanese aquariums agreed to stop buying from the hunts, but the black market adapted. Buyers from China, Russia, and the Middle East simply skipped the middlemen. Private brokers arrived in unmarked boats. The price of a trained dolphin soared, and the killing continued. Meanwhile, the filmmakers themselves paid the price. Louis C. Hoyos received death threats. His production office was broken into. Anonymous letters warned him to stay out of Japan. Hackers targeted the Oceanic Preservation Society, the non-profit behind the Cove. One crew member found a GPS tracker attached to his car. The pressure was constant, but they stood firm. Chi Hoyos used the momentum from the Cove to launch new investigations into endangered sharks, coral reefs, and illegal wildlife trafficking. Each time the model was the same: go where no one else would go, and film what no one else was allowed to show. Because the camera when used with courage, is still the most dangerous weapon in the world. And the Cove had proven that. For years after the film's release, the footage remained banned on Japanese television. Attempts to screen the documentary in Tokyo were met with violent protests from right-wing nationalists. One cinema was forced to cancel after masked men stormed the building. But slowly, very slowly, cracks began to appear. A new generation of Japanese youth, raised with internet access and growing skepticism, began questioning the old narratives. Dolphin meat, once considered a staple in some towns, began disappearing from shelves. Health ministries, quietly, acknowledged the mercury problem. Teachers stopped promoting dolphin consumption in schools. And most of all, the silence cracked. People were talking, in secret, online, in small meetings, in whispered conversations. Because when a truth that powerful enters the world, you can't put it back in the vault. The ocean doesn't forget. The dolphins don't forget. And now, neither does the world. Change doesn't always begin with revolution. Sometimes it begins with a single frame of footage, too raw to ignore, too real to explain away. The Cove left behind more than an exposed crime. It created a fracture in the world's collective understanding of marine life, and of its own role in systems of violence disguised as entertainment or tradition. It didn't just open eyes, it opened wounds, but it also forced healing. In the years following the film's release, something remarkable happened, not instantly, not loudly, but undeniably. The story of Taiji, once hidden behind polite smiles and closed doors, became global. School children in Denmark debated it in ethics class. Environmental studies programs assigned the Cove alongside Silent Spring. Whale-watching tours added dolphins to their educational content, openly discussing the hunt. And former aquarium trainers, inspired by Rico Barry's journey, became some of the most passionate advocates for marine freedom. They weren't radical, they had just seen what the rest of the world finally had. And seeing changed everything. Louis C. Hoyos, reflecting years later, said the most profound impact of the film wasn't in the protests or awards. It was in the letters, thousands of them, from viewers who had never cared about dolphins before, from fishermen who said they'd left the trade, from students who chose biology over business. Because of that one night, they stayed up and pressed play. And from survivors. Because there were survivors. Dolphins who escaped the hunt. Dolphins rescued. Dolphins freed from tanks where they had floated in silent depression for years. Rico Barry continued working with sanctuaries around the world, creating natural sea pens where captive dolphins could rediscover space, tide, freedom. The work was never easy, never clean. Many animals had been broken beyond repair, their sonar dulled, their muscles atrophied, their minds conditioned by years of forced performance. But some slowly returned to swimming, to socializing, to wild currents they hadn't felt since birth. These moments didn't make headlines, but they made history. Meanwhile, the Cove reshaped the blueprint of activist filmmaking. No longer was it enough to talk about injustice. Now filmmakers brought evidence, technology, strategy, drones, hidden mics, underwater acoustics. Documentaries like Racing Extinction, Seaspiracy, and The Ivory Game were born in the wake of the Cove, inheriting its courage and its cinematic grit. Because the Cove didn't just tell a story, it taught a method: show the hidden, tell the truth, protect the vulnerable, and take the risk. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Cove lies in the uncomfortable truth it left behind, that cruelty persists not because of hate, but because of habit. Because we don't look. Because we believe the smiling dolphin, the quiet shelf of mystery meat, the sanitized aquarium show. The film shattered that illusion, but it didn't offer comfort. It offered responsibility. And responsibility is harder. It means asking what we fund when we buy a ticket, what we accept when we remain silent, what we allow when we label violence as cultural practice, instead of questioning whether culture can evolve. It means remembering that a peaceful town can hide a blood-stained cove, that a smiling trainer may be holding a dying heart, that a tourist photo can capture someone else's prison, but also remembering that a handful of filmmakers, armed with courage, compassion, and covert cameras, cracked through layers of secrecy, protected by nation-states. And they did it not with violence, but with light. There's a moment near the end of the Cove that rarely leaves the minds of those who see it. Rico Barry walks into an international forum in Denmark, wearing a screen strapped to his chest. It plays the footage, the real footage, as he walks silently among delegates, politicians and decision-makers. No slogans, no shouts, just blood-red water flickering across his body as the images force themselves into polite conversation. No one can look away. That's the final act of the Cove. Not persuasion, confrontation. Because after all the bans, the outrage, what matters most is that people finally saw, and what they do next is the only thing that still matters. Today the dolphin hunts in Taiji continue, but they no longer happen in the dark. Every year, activists return, cameras roll, the world watches, and though it may feel like not enough has changed, the truth is everything has. Because now the Cove is not just a place, it is a question. What will you do with what you've seen? And for those who choose silence, the film still waits, streaming, whispering, remembering, because sometimes the bravest thing a film can do is leave you unable to forget.
Titicut Follies. It opens with music, a chorus of off-key singing, performed by the inmates of a state mental hospital. They are dressed in sequins and leotards, paper hats, and heavy makeup. Some sway slightly, confused. Others grin at the lights. The show is called Titicut Follies. It's a talent review, meant to raise morale. Staff clap awkwardly. An MC makes a joke about madness and manners, and then everything changes. The scene cuts. Suddenly you're in a stark, fluorescent-lit room. A naked man stands alone, surrounded by guards. He shivers. He mumbles. One officer barks a question. The man does not respond. Another man, a doctor, approaches with a razor. Without ceremony, he begins shaving the inmate's head. No explanation, no warmth, just procedure. The man tries to speak. He's ignored. The camera doesn't look away. You want to, but you can't, because what Frederick Wiseman captured inside Bridgewater State Hospital in Massachusetts in 1966 wasn't fiction. It wasn't even dramatized. It was documentary in the rawest, most ruthless sense, unnarrated, unfiltered, and for decades, unseen. This was the first American film to be banned, not for obscenity, or sedition, or national security, but for truth. Titicut Follies exposed the brutal, dehumanizing reality of life inside a mental institution, and the system's desperate, coordinated effort to make sure no one else ever saw it. Wiseman wasn't a filmmaker when he began. He was a lawyer, a professor, but he had taken his students on field trips to Bridgewater. What he saw stayed with him. The routines, the rituals, the neglect, wrapped in bureaucracy. It haunted him. So he approached the Massachusetts government for access. Somehow, miraculously, they granted it. What followed was not a film crew, in the traditional sense. It was just Wiseman and cinematographer John Marshall, a single camera, a single microphone, no actors, no scripts, just the institution and its truth. What they captured is now legend. An inmate force-fed through a tube while muttering for help. Guards mocking patients during strip searches. A catatonic man left alone in a bare cell, naked, smeared with filth. A doctor describing a patient's sexual deviance while casually smoking a cigarette. And always, the camera watching, silent, merciless. The most disturbing scenes are not the most graphic, they are the mundane ones. Bureaucrats chatting as they prepare forms to have patients transferred. A doctor gently dismissing a patient's paranoia, then approving involuntary medication. A social worker laughing at a patient's rambling monologue. These aren't monsters, they're civil servants, and that's what makes it unbearable. Bridgewater was meant to be a hospital, but what Titicut Follies revealed was a prison, worse, a warehouse, a place where men were sent not to be healed, but to be forgotten. Most had never been convicted of a crime. Some were there for petty theft. Some had been declared incompetent to stand trial. Others were simply mentally ill and had no family to advocate for them. They were stripped, locked away, and catalogued like furniture. And yet for a time, no one in the government thought anything was wrong. The film, after all, was approved. Filming continued for weeks. No one stopped Wiseman. The staff barely acknowledged the camera. To them, this was normal. That was the horror. This wasn't an exposé of a freak accident. It was a mirror, and America couldn't bear to look. When Wiseman finished editing the film, he submitted it to the New York Film Festival. In 1967, it premiered to stunned silence and critical acclaim. Reviewers praised its bravery, its rawness, its unflinching moral force. There were gasps in the theater, walkouts. Some viewers cried, others sat frozen in their seats, long after the credits rolled. But not everyone applauded. Massachusetts officials, suddenly realizing the scope of what had been captured, moved swiftly. They filed for an injunction to ban the film's distribution, claiming it violated the privacy of the patients depicted, despite the fact that most had no legal guardians, and that Wiseman had been granted access with consent at the time of filming. The court agreed. In a landmark and controversial decision, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court banned the film from public exhibition, citing invasion of privacy. Only doctors, lawyers, and academics could view it, under tightly controlled conditions. All other showings were illegal. Just like that, Titicut Follies became the first film in U.S. history banned for reasons other than national security or obscenity, and for more than 2 decades, it was locked away. Whispers remained. Pirated VHS copies circulated among radical film circles and civil rights lawyers. College professors showed fragments in ethics seminars. Human rights groups cited the footage in reports, but couldn't show it. All the while, Bridgewater remained open. Some reforms came, but the core remained. It wasn't until 1991, after repeated legal battles and the death or release of all patients shown in the film, that a Massachusetts judge finally lifted the ban. The film could now be shown, but only with a disclaimer. Conditions depicted no longer reflect the current practices of Bridgewater State Hospital. It was a hollow disclaimer, because the power of the footage remained intact. Decades had passed, but the truth was still visible in every frame. The bruises, the indifference, the hollow laughter of nurses, the glassy eyes of forgotten men. Nothing had changed, except the ability to look. Titicut Follies was finally unleashed, not just as a film, but as a document, a testimony, a reckoning. It went on to influence generations of documentarians. It redefined what non-fiction cinema could be. Not commentary, but confrontation.
And it asked a question that remains unanswered. What does it mean to be human when humanity is stripped away? In the next part, we'll explore the ripple effects of the ban, how Wiseman's career evolved, the larger implications of the film for mental health policy and cinematic ethics, and what modern investigations still reveal about America's institutional failures. The ban didn't kill the film. It made it infamous. While Titicut Follies was legally locked in vaults, it pulsed like an exposed wire beneath the surface of American culture, forbidden, whispered, teetered but unseen. Like a banned book or a censored photograph, it carried a weight its creators never anticipated, and its suppressors never understood, because in trying to silence it, they proved its point. The system didn't need to murder its subjects to erase them. It only needed to make sure no one watched. Wiseman, thrust into a legal war he hadn't planned for, refused to back down. He became a quiet but relentless advocate, not just for his own film, but for the right of documentary, as a form of political speech. With each passing year, the film's reputation grew, even in absence. It was discussed in law schools, in film theory, in psychology programs. Harvard held closed-door screenings for ethics committees. Mental health advocates lobbied for it to be publicly available, not just as a warning, but as a mirror. Because while Titicut Follies captured one hospital, it reflected many. Bridgewater was just one node in a nationwide system of institutional abandonment. Across the U.S., on facilities from Willowbrook to Pennhurst to Byberry, stories began to surface: patients tied to beds for days, left naked in hallways, force-fed or starved, punished for incoherence with electroshock, drugged into submission instead of treated. And still, Titicut Follies could not be shown. Every time the state defended the ban, they said it was for patient privacy. But the patients had no voices, and the public had no eyes. What the government feared was not a privacy violation. It was recognition that those men locked in barren rooms, shaved by force, taunted by guards, were not monsters. They were ours, and we'd failed them. When the ban was finally lifted in 1991, it wasn't because the system had grown more humane. It was because the people inside the footage had died. The court concluded that their right to privacy had expired with them. It was a grim loophole, but it opened the floodgates. The film was released commercially, and for the first time, the public saw what had been kept from them. Audiences were stunned. Many were silent. Some walked out. Some cried. What struck most viewers wasn't the brutality, but the bureaucracy, the endless forms, the mindless routines, the way cruelty disguised itself as process. A doctor explaining why a patient was force-fed while calmly flipping through a chart. A social worker describing delusions with the same tone used for grocery lists. The total absence of empathy. And the camera, always present, never intervening, forced the viewer into complicity. It was no longer possible to say I didn't know. And that's when the questions started. Not about the past, but the present. What institutions were still hiding their own follies? How many Bridgewaters still existed, just without cameras? What does justice mean in a system where the most vulnerable are placed furthest from sight? Wiseman never offered answers. He simply kept filming. In the decades that followed, he would go on to make over 40 documentaries, each embedded deep inside a public institution: high schools, prisons, libraries, zoos, police precincts, welfare offices. Each film quiet, observational, unsparing, but none carried the voltage of Titicut Follies. Because that first film wasn't just art, it was exposure. And in its wake, the language of cinema changed. Filmmakers like Errol Morris, Laura Poitras, and Joshua Oppenheimer cite Wiseman as foundational, not because he taught them how to shoot, but because he taught them how to see. how to listen to systems, how to find truth in repetition, silence, boredom, and cruelty. Even the visual vocabulary of modern prestige drama, long shots, fluorescent lighting, clinical slowness, owes a debt to Titicut Follies. But the film didn't just influence aesthetics, it forced accountability. In Massachusetts, reports following the film's re-release sparked a new round of inspections at state facilities. In 1992, federal oversight of Bridgewater increased. New regulations around involuntary hospitalization were introduced. Oversight boards gained teeth. Still, reform moved slowly. By 2014, Bridgewater was again in the news, after reports that patients had been held in solitary confinement for months, even years. Lawsuits followed, internal reviews, apologies. The film had been right, and still, it was happening. Because systems don't reform from shame, they reform from pressure, and pressure requires people to know, which is why the film even 50 years later remains necessary. It screamed, not as a relic, but as a live case file. It reminds medical students that patients are not data. It reminds wardens that dignity is not optional. It reminds lawmakers that bureaucracy is not neutral. It's shaped by values. And sometimes, those values are empty. Titicut Follies wasn't made to change the world, but it changed the way the world was allowed to look at itself. In the final shot, an inmate, emaciated, mute, is wheeled into a room. He is ignored. He is visible, but unseen. He stares toward the lens, though it's unclear if he understands what it is. And for one unbearable moment, we stare back. We're not just watching the film, we're being watched, because ultimately, Titicut Follies isn't just about institutions, it's about us. About what we allow when we aren't looking. About what we excuse when we call cruelty by other names, like discipline, like order, like normal, and about what happens when someone dares to film what was never meant to be remembered. But it cannot guarantee what we do with it. 50 years after its first suppressed screening, Titicut Follies still lingers like a bruise beneath the skin of American memory. Not fully healed, not easily forgotten. Its images, grainy, black and white, unflinching, continue to unsettle, because what they reveal is not just cruelty, they reveal indifference, and indifference is harder to defeat. Today Bridgewater State Hospital still exists, though rebranded, restructured, and reformed. Patients now wear clothing. Cells have doors. Doctors are trained in trauma-informed care. Surveillance is now digital, constant, and clinical. It looks better, but the question remains, has the substance changed, or only the surface? In the decades since the film's release, American mental health policy has been gutted, rebuilt, gutted again. Large-scale institutions were closed in the 1980s and 1990s, hailed as progress, but the promised community-based care systems never fully arrived. The result, jails became the new asylums. As of 2024, the largest mental health providers in the United States are no longer hospitals, they are prisons. Cook County Jail, Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island. An estimated 44% of inmates in U.S. jails have a diagnosed mental illness. Many of them were arrested not for crimes, but for symptoms, public breakdowns, homelessness, psychosis misinterpreted as aggression. The system didn't disappear, it just moved. And now, no one is filming. Because what Titicut Follies taught us is that institutions will only show us what we demand to see, and only until we stop looking. The ethical questions the film raised remain fiercely debated today. Is it right to film the suffering of people who cannot give informed consent? What is the line between documentation and exploitation? Can a camera, no matter how well-intentioned, become another instrument of control? Wiseman always insisted, he did not exploit his subjects, he revealed their exploitation. His camera never manipulated, never staged, never narrated. But it didn't intervene either. Some critics have argued that his observational style, while revolutionary, created emotional distance, that watching a man be force-fed without commentary may numb as much as it shocks. Others defend it as a moral choice, refusing to tell the audience what to feel, trusting the truth of the image to speak for itself. But Titicut Follies was never about conclusions. It was about confrontation, and that confrontation has shaped generations of documentarians. Films like The Thin Blue Line, The Act of Killing, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, inspired loosely by psychiatric institutions, and The Look of Silence owe debts to Wiseman's unblinking lens. Even streaming-era true crime, obsessed with the system, echoes his blueprint, though rarely with the same ethical rigor. In 2017, on the film's 50th anniversary, the Museum of Modern Art held a full retrospective of Wiseman's work. Audiences returned, older, more cynical perhaps, but still unprepared. A journalist wrote, "You walk in expecting history. You walk out feeling implicated." That is Titicut Follies' most dangerous power. It implicates us. Not as perpetrators perhaps, but as citizens. As people who benefit from silence. As people who don't ask where the mentally ill go when they disappear from sidewalks, or what happens after someone is declared incompetent, or how many layers of procedure it takes to bury a scream. And more broadly, it challenges the very notion of visibility. Because in an age of endless content, surveillance, live streams, and viral outrage, how is it that certain institutions remain as opaque as they were in 1967? Why do we still fear looking behind closed doors? Why are we more comfortable watching horror on Netflix than reality in a documentary? And when the camera does show us, when the truth is undeniable, what do we do? Do we act? Or do we scroll? This is what Titicut Follies leaves us with. Not closure, not comfort, but responsibility. Because the film doesn't end. Not really. It lingers in every courtroom where a mentally ill defendant is railroaded into a guilty plea. In every emergency room where a psych patient is restrained for lack of beds. In every prison cell where a man talks to walls and no one listens. And in every institution that calls itself care, but acts as containment. Frederick Wiseman once said, "If you want to understand a society, look at its institutions. That's where its values live." Titicut Follies forced us to look, and what we saw, we cannot unsee. A naked man in a cold room, a feeding tube pushed down a throat, a laugh in the face of suffering, a system running on silence, and a camera, just one, that refused to look away.
The war game. The bombs never fell, but Peter Watkins made the world believe they had. In 1965, at the height of Cold War dread, the BBC commissioned a young, fiercely original director named Peter Watkins to create a television drama about nuclear war. Not a science fiction thriller, not a political panel, but a realistic simulation of what would happen if Britain, calm, suburban, organized Britain, suffered a direct nuclear attack. What Watkins delivered wasn't just a film, it was a prophecy, and the moment the government saw it, they panicked. The war game was deemed too horrifying for the public. The BBC shelved it indefinitely. Politicians whispered about national morale. Journalists were told to stop asking questions. Viewers would not see the film on British television until 1985, 20 years after it was made. But by then, it had already become legend, and for those who finally watched it, the damage was done. The opening frames are calm, pastoral, British. A narrator, cool, measured, documentary style, explains that NATO has escalated tensions with the Eastern Bloc, a crisis in Southeast Asia, mobilization in Europe, protests in the streets, military readiness increased. Then, it happens, a single warhead detonates over Kent, and Britain becomes a shadow. But Watkins doesn't show mushroom clouds with swelling orchestras. He shows confusion, traffic jams, emergency radio broadcasts, parents told to evacuate, but given no fuel, cities locked in panic, people begging for answers, and getting only static, and then, the firestorm, flash, wind, ash, bodies turned to silhouettes, hospitals collapsing, food gone, water contaminated, martial law declared, the rules break faster than they are made, the streets fall quiet, and then the dying begins. What makes the war game terrifying, even now, is not the spectacle, it's the realism. Shot in a pseudo-documentary style, the film uses handheld cameras, staged interviews, and newsreel aesthetics to simulate a BBC News broadcast in the aftermath of a nuclear strike. There are no stars, no actors anyone would recognize, only ordinary people, filmed in grayscale, speaking into the lens as though they're trying to reach you, and they do, because the war game doesn't feel like fiction, it feels like history that hasn't happened yet. Watkins had done his homework. He consulted official British government civil defense plans. He read declassified American documents on radiation burns, thermal blast injuries, and psychological trauma. He interviewed doctors, soldiers, priests, teachers. He studied Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The figures quoted in the film, casualty estimates, blast radii, psychological collapse rates, were real. So were the effects: charred flesh, cataracts, skin sliding off in sheets, suicides in makeshift bunkers, children dying of thirst in sports halls converted into fallout shelters, priests blessing bodies in lines, police shooting looters, soldiers denying food to families with contaminated clothes, all simulated, all plausible, all real enough that the UK Home Office allegedly demanded it be shut down before it reached viewers. The BBC, caught between its mandate to inform and its duty to protect, folded. Publicly, they claimed the film's quality was not in question, it was simply not suitable for broadcast. Privately, they were terrified. The British government, despite years of civil defense rhetoric, knew its population was wholly unprepared for nuclear war. The war game revealed just how thin the illusion of safety was, how quickly the social contract would shatter once the phone stopped working and the walls caught fire. It wasn't anti-British, it was anti-myth, and myths, in 1965, were how nations survived. Watkins was furious. He publicly condemned the BBC's censorship. He held unauthorized screenings. He smuggled copies to international festivals. The film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, even though it had never aired on TV. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. The Vatican listed it among essential films for moral reflection. Bertrand Russell praised it. The military condemned it, and audiences, they couldn't unsee it. Bootleg VHS copies circulated through universities. Activist groups used it to protest nuclear expansion. Psychiatrists used scenes to explain trauma. Survivors of Hiroshima said it was the closest thing they'd ever seen to their memories, and they wished they'd never seen it, because the war game wasn't about death. It was about the things that come before, the fear, the failure, the silence. In one scene, a young nurse breaks down on camera. She describes trying to comfort a child with third-degree burns. There was no morphine, no water, nothing to do but hold the child until he died. I told him he was going home soon, she says. I lied. Another scene shows a priest conducting mass funerals. He stares into the camera. God is not in this, he says. Only ash. There is no music, only wind and static. The film ends with a list of statistics, not imagined ones, real ones, projected deaths, fallout zones, civilian suffering. The voiceover fades, the screen goes dark, and the silence that follows is the loudest part of the film, because it leaves you not with emotion, but responsibility. Watkins would go on to make more politically charged films, Punishment Park, Edvard Munch, La Commune, but none would ever be buried quite like The War Game.
none would strike quite as deep, because the war game wasn't censored because it lied. It was censored because it was believable, too believable, because it didn't say, "What if?" It said, "When?" In the quiet vacuum left by the BBC's suppression of the war game, something strange began to happen. The silence turned radioactive. Instead of fading into obscurity, the film grew larger, more dangerous, more whispered, a piece of forbidden knowledge, a reel of celluloid you weren't supposed to see, and therefore had to. It became a ghost film, mentioned in student circles, circulated in activist cells, smuggled between countries like samizdat in the Soviet bloc. Because the ban didn't erase the images, it only fueled curiosity, and those who had seen it, often at clandestine screenings, spoke of it in reverent tones. "It's not a film," one said, "it's a reckoning." Watkins was devastated by the censorship, but he didn't retreat. He refused to be silenced. He fought the ban in interviews, letters, festivals. He brought the film to Cannes, to Venice, to Berlin. Wherever people would listen, or were afraid to, he spoke, not about annihilation, but about apathy, about what it means to pretend preparedness while doing nothing. And as the film traveled underground, it began doing exactly what the government feared, shaping minds. In university auditoriums and labor union halls, the war game became a kind of visual sermon, a truth wrapped in grainy footage. Students left stunned. Teachers paused their lectures, unable to resume. More than once, projectionists wept, because the film didn't lecture, it prophesied. And the further the Cold War escalated, the more prescient it felt. In 1969, the US President's Science Advisory Committee watched the film. One member said, "It should be required viewing, not banned." But in Britain, the ban held. For 2 decades. It wasn't until 1985, 20 years after the film was completed, that the BBC finally relented. Why then? The political climate had shifted. Anti-nuclear movements were swelling across Europe. The Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp had become a symbol of civilian resistance. The CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was resurging, and Margaret Thatcher's government, increasingly criticized for its alignment with US military policy, was cracking under public scrutiny. The BBC saw a chance for redemption and ratings. On July 31, 1985, the war game aired for the first time on British television. No introduction, no apology, just the film, and the country held its breath. Viewers tuned in by the millions. Some were watching for the first time. Others had waited 20 years. Letters poured in. Praise, horror, a sense of vindication, of revelation, of being forced to finally face something the nation had deliberately buried. One viewer wrote, "I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I dreamed my children had ashes for faces." Another, "They banned it to protect us from fear. But fear is what should have saved us." The impact was immediate. Activist organizations used the broadcast to renew pressure on Parliament. Civil defense policies were publicly mocked. Even government officials began to admit, in careful guarded terms, that their protect and survive rhetoric had been hollow at best. Watkins, now older, battle-hardened, watched all of this from the side. He didn't gloat. He didn't say "I told you so." He just nodded. The war he had warned about hadn't come, not yet. But the war for truth had just barely been won. And still, the echoes remained. The war game was taught in schools, shown in ethics courses, studied by filmmakers, doctors, journalists. It became a case study in moral courage and in institutional cowardice, because at its heart, the film didn't just ask, "What if the bomb drops?" It asked, "What if the government is lying?" Not through malice, but through inertia. Through fear, through the unbearable truth that in the face of nuclear war, there is no plan, no shelter, no escape, only smoke, bone, silence. In later interviews, Watkins reflected bitterly on the ban. He believed the BBC had caved not to public interest, but to political intimidation, that by accepting censorship, they set a precedent, that the state could silence art by calling it too effective. It was, in his view, a betrayal, and it wounded him, but it also shaped him. His subsequent films, Punishment Park, Privilege, La Commune, were more radical, more aggressive in form and message. He never again trusted broadcasters. He worked outside the system, often alone, often broke, but always uncompromising. He became less a director than a cultural insurgent, and the war game was his banner. In an era now overflowing with media, with simulation, with docudramas and disaster porn, it's hard to remember how revolutionary Watkins' methods were. He didn't just blur fact and fiction, he forced them into conflict. He made the viewer complicit in the simulation. You weren't just watching a nuclear strike, you were living one. There were no actors playing generals, no politicians giving speeches, only you, and the people around you, trying to survive something you didn't understand. It's no coincidence that the film influenced not just artists, but psychologists, civil defense planners, even military thinkers. It forced all of them to ask, what does prepared even mean? A tin of biscuits, a warning siren, a basement. The war game showed what would really happen: panic, breakdown, denial, death, and then silence. Again and again, silence, because at the center of the nuclear narrative lies a void, the thing we cannot comprehend, totality. And into that void, Watkins dared to send a signal, a 48-minute scream, masked as realism, and the world, slowly, painfully, began to hear it. It would have been easy for the war game to vanish. After all, it was only 48 minutes long. It aired once. It was grainy, monochrome, performed by non-actors in backyards and public halls. It had no explosions, no stars, no budget for spectacle, but somehow, this small silenced film outlived the Cold War itself, not by predicting the end, but by exposing how easily the end could begin. And in doing so, it planted seeds, seeds that would grow into movements, warnings, and an entire new generation of political cinema. Anti-nuclear activism surged in the decades after the film's release. But Watkins' contribution wasn't a rallying cry, it was something deeper. He didn't plead or persuade, he forced the viewer to confront their own vulnerability, their own assumptions. He didn't say, "You're in danger." He said, "You're pretending you're not." This subtle shift shaped how future activists framed their cause. It wasn't just about governments and treaties. It was about consciousness, about memory, about refusing to forget what might still happen. Greenpeace organizers referenced the film in their early campaigns. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, screened it in British churches. German peace activists translated it and showed it in town halls across Europe. Protesters carried stills from the film, not slogans, but black and white images of men holding bleeding children, made of makeup and honesty. The film became a cultural ghost, always present at the edge of every conversation about deterrence, doctrine, and doctrine's collapse. In Japan, the war game was screened for survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One survivor wept afterward. "They've never seen it," she said, "but this man did." She meant Watkins, and she was right, because for all its careful realism, its BBC-approved tone, and documentarian restraint, the war game has an emotional truth that exceeds fact. It feels real, because deep down, we know it could be, and perhaps still could. In recent years, the relevance of the film has only deepened, not because we're facing the same crisis, but because we're facing new ones. Climate collapse, pandemic denial, AI escalation, food insecurity, algorithmic warfare, disinformation campaigns, and still, the official line is often the same as it was in 1965. "Don't worry, we have a plan." But Watkins showed what that plan really looks like. Clipboards, vague announcements, paper drills, and then nothing, just silence and ash. Filmmakers across the globe have studied the war game, not for its plot, but for its moral architecture. The way it disarms you before it detonates. The way it never lies, but never flinches. It became the inspiration for docu-hybrids, Like Threads 1984, When the Wind Blows 1986, The Day After 1983, all of which owed their credibility to Watkins' template. Even recent works like Chernobyl, HBO, or Don't Look Up Netflix trace their DNA to the war game. Stories that scream through simulation, that demand viewers feel before they understand. And yet, nothing has ever quite matched the raw force of Watkins' original. Perhaps because it was the first, perhaps because it was real, or perhaps because it came from a place that had nothing to gain. Watkins didn't make the film for money, or glory, or politics. He made it because he believed the public had a right to see the world without its comforting filters. Because he believed democracy, without truth, is just theater. And he was right. That belief came at a cost. The BBC never apologized. The government never acknowledged the suppression. Watkins was effectively blacklisted from major broadcasters. His subsequent films were marginalized, underfunded, misunderstood. He spent much of his career in Sweden, France, and Canada, creating masterworks in exile. But he never stopped, and neither did his film. In 2023, The War Game was screened at the United Nations, not as an artifact, but as a warning, a reminder that our ability to destroy ourselves has always exceeded our ability to imagine it, and that sometimes the only thing standing between reality and annihilation is a camera, not for surveillance, but for truth, to hold a mirror up to a society determined not to see its own reflection. The War Game was banned because it worked, because it terrified, because it was too effective at making people ask, what would I do? And the answer, whether whispered in 1965 or screamed in 2025, is almost always, I don't know. But Peter Watkins did. He knew what it would look like. He knew how it would sound. He knew what would burn. And above all, he knew that if no one showed it, no one would believe it. And maybe that's the film's most radical legacy. Not the Academy Award, not the broken silence, not the delayed broadcast, but the fact that even now, decades later, it forces us to imagine something we spend our lives trying not to. Not because we want to, but because we must. Because memory is a weapon. Because art is resistance. Because silence kills. And because sometimes, when the world teeters too close to the edge, what saves it is a film that was never meant to be seen.